Kalimera. Good morning. It's a fantastic turnout. Thank you all very much for coming. I think today's turnout is really a testament to how critical the 2020 sulphur cap dilemma is for the shipping industry in general. This is the 7th conference that Bunkernet is hosting, and there was no doubt in our mind that this year that the sulphur cap was going to be the focus and a discussion on the implications. Today's conference is in association with IBIA, an association that has worked tirelessly to bring to its members and the wider shipping community up-to-date developments directly from the IMO and other stakeholders. We are very lucky to have them with us. In addition to working closely with IBIA, Bunkernet has employed significant resources to better understand how January 1st is going to look. Admittedly, it's been quite difficult to look into the future, but what we have done is continuously map information that we are receiving from government agencies, industry associations, refineries, and most importantly, physical suppliers. So right now we have pricing structures, availability, and specifications in most major ports. So we're able to answer a lot of questions regarding on what's available and where, and what kind of price ranges are going to be available in Q3 and Q4 of 2019, and then going forward into 2020. Combined with our speakers, I just want to say that they are from very diverse backgrounds, and they are experts in their field, and again we are very lucky to have them. I think today's conference, through the speakers, you're able to answer a lot of the dilemmas that you have in your mind, and they are available to you until lunchtime to answer those questions. Now, to make it easier, we have tried to use technology to be able to communicate with both the speakers and the panel that's going to be happening at the end. So we have given instructions on your seats. Basically, all you need to do is go into either a roaming data or the hotel Wi-Fi, and you just put in any browser dna.gr/2020, and it will take you to a polling page, and there you are able to ask questions or vote on questions that we are going to ask. So firstly, I would like to invite Uni and Imo to present Life After 2020 Sulphur Cap. Uni is the director of IBIA and the IMO representative, so she's sitting down in the IMO meetings. You're going to hear it from the horse's mouth, and she has first-hand knowledge through the IMO and for both regulations and the challenges that we will face. So let's go to the first polling question.
Slide.
Yeah? Okay. So the first question, if everybody has their phones open, it's technology. Okay, until we get it working, the question is availability of the fuel that operators want, so MGO, VLSFO, and HSFO. Would that be the biggest challenge? Quality of 0.5 sulfur fuel blends, increase in the cost of business for buyers and sellers, or compliance and effective enforcement. These are the four questions. Can you all see them on your phones? Yeah. Okay, it's not coming up. So I think Uni, come up and we'll answer the question at the end. Okay. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. And first of all, thank you so much to Bunkernet for inviting IBIA to work with them and looking after us so well. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with you so far. Is my presentation coming up, or do I have to click it? Oh, see, there you go. The opening slide, the title of my presentation is Life After 2020. I think it's more correct to say Foundations for Life After 2020, because we're forecasting things at the moment, and the thing I'm here to talk to you about is a lot about the IMO framework, so that you can understand that better if you don't already. And being the first speaker of the day on the 2020 issue, for once I get to have this slide that everybody has a version of, I'm sure, which is regarding the sulphur limits on the MARPOL Annex 6. So I'm not going to remind you of those, you can see them, but the one thing that I would remind you of is to remember that MARPOL Annex 6 was adopted by the IMO in 1997, so it's not new. It didn't come into force until 2005, because that's how long it took to get sufficient tonnage and member states signed up to it. And no sooner had it entered into force in 2005 that the revision process started, because it was recognized that the global cap of 4.5% and even the eco limit of 1.5%, they were going to need to be tightened. So the revision process started in 2005, and in 2008 the revision was agreed. And that's when we got the bracketing down in the sulphur limits for the emission control areas, and the bracketing down of the global limit. And already then we knew that the global limit was going to be 0.5%. The only thing we didn't know was whether the 0.5% would be introduced in 2020 or in 2025. And that was going to be decided on the basis of an availability study, which, according to MARPOL Annex 6, needed to be conducted prior to 2018. Luckily, we got that in 2016, so that in... Wait. My clicker doesn't seem to work, I'm sorry. Here we are. In 2016, we got the study, and as you all know, that study said, okay, there will be sufficient availability of 0.5 fuels from the global refining sector in 2020. And on the basis of that study, the decision was made that we will have 2020. One thing that's very important to note about that study is these assumptions that we see. About 11% should be scrubbed, max 10% sulphur fuels, about 12% of the total, because we still have emission control areas and import requirements for those type of fuels. The vast majority will be fuels between 0.1 and 0.5 and at 73%. And one important thing to note about that is that while in 2008, when that revision was adopted and the global sulphur limit was going to be 0.5, everybody thought 0.5, that means we're going to distillates. Now, when the eco limit fell to 0.1, everybody thought, obviously, distillates. And then it turned out that actually no, there are some other opportunities in the market, and now that availability study did not assume that these 0.5 max fuels would be distillates only, but in fact blends. And that changed the picture somewhat for all of us. So, to just give you an impression of how large this change really is, I've drawn up some sulphur average studies. This is based on data from the IMO. These are 2017, these graphs, but the 2018 figures are almost identical. And what that really demonstrates to you is the scale of the change that needs to happen, because as you can see on the sulphur, on the residual fuels, while the sulphur average is 2.6%, the vast majority is higher sulphur. So in terms of availability of those really, really low sulphur fuel oils, that's less than 2% are naturally below 0.5, and there's not that much in the market at the moment that is in that very, very low sulphur range, which will lend itself easily to be blended down to be compliant. When it comes to distillates, the vast majority of distillates meet the 0.10 limit, because that's where the demand is, and so the sulphur average is actually just 0.8. And if you see that column on the right here, you can see that the vast majority of fuels is 0.1 or less. So the options for 2020, I think they're quite well known by now, along with the uncertainties, and I'm not going to dwell too long on this because the next speaker will talk a lot about the quality. We know we can have distillates. Marine gas oil is well known, widely available today. The question really is whether there will be sufficient to meet demand if everybody decided to go for marine gas oil. Could you meet that increase in demand? Because it's a substantial increase. We also have some issues around the quality of it. Is the quality going to be the same as it is today, or will that increase in demand mean that you get more from the same pool as the land fuels, which means flashpoint could be an issue, lubricity could be an issue. We also have a group of distillates called vacuum gas oil, which is a heavy distillate. It's a great product if you burn it, but it has some cold flow and compatibility issues. And many people think really that vacuum gas oil doesn't belong in the distillates anyways. It belongs in this next category, which is very low sulfur fuel oils, i.e. the fuel blends meeting 0.5 or less, which will contain some resids, distillates, and a number of other blend stocks. And it's those other blend stocks which are causing some of the uncertainties around the quality. And at the moment, we don't know too much about the quality because while it's being produced on a trial basis, there's no real demand yet because obviously the shipping world doesn't want to start burning a significantly more expensive fuel until they have to. And then we have the high sulfur fuel plus scrubber option, and the uncertainty about that is supply infrastructure, because we don't think there's going to be a shortage of high sulfur fuels as a commodity. But if it's just maybe 10% of global demand and a limited number of ports will maintain that supply infrastructure, because you can't have a tank sitting around waiting for a ship to drop by with a scrubber. You need to know where the demand is, so it's only the big turnaround ports that will definitely have it, and elsewhere it might be on a contract basis. So what must ships have to comply with Annex 6? This is just some of the basic tools. First of all, the bunker supplier has to provide the ship with a bunker delivery note, and that needs to declare the sulfur content, the exact sulfur content of every product delivered. And the bunker supplier needs to provide a MARPOL sample. And this MARPOL sample there are guidelines for drawing it, and it is to be kept by the ship. And the only purpose of the MARPOL sample is that it's something that port state control officers can use to check whether the fuel delivered to the ship meets the requirements. Also, if every ship has to have an International Air Pollution Prevention certificate, all ships have to have that. And if you are using a exhaust gas cleaning system or scrubber, then you need to have a supplement showing that the equipment you have on board has been approved and that it works. And that's the bit that proves that you are allowed to use a high sulfur fuel. Now, taking a step back for this bunker delivery note, it's been changed. So since the start of this year, there's a new requirement for the bunker delivery note. If you see here, the text in black is what it looked like originally. And then all the purple stuff is new text, and then there's a bit that was deleted. Why did we need a new one? Well, this bit that's been deleted says applicable, that you just say the supplier declared that the fuel I deliver to you complies with either the ECA limit or the global limit. Come 2020, if they had to do that, then you couldn't supply any fuel above 0.5, and then you would have a problem to supply fuel to ships with scrubbers, which is why you have come up with the IMO has come up with this text for the requirement for the bunker delivery note, that it could you could do the limit value given in regulation 14.1, 14.4, or the purchaser's specified value of however much sulfur that is, on the basis of a notification of how that fuel is intended to be used compliantly. Now, I don't know whether everybody here thinks, yeah, I know exactly what regulation 14.1 and what regulation 14.4 is. Do you know that? Do you all know that? IBIA has suggested that there is a possible way to make this thing a bit more clear, because although that is the regular requirement in terms of what needs to be included in the bunker delivery note, it's not actually a template. And this is something that we established very clearly at the IMO. It's not a template, this is the legal requirement. So you are free to put in a format that is more clear. And so, for example, this year, it would make sense to say put in the sulfur limits, so 3.5 or 0.5, and then delete as appropriate, because that would give you the opportunity towards the end of this year to use this bunker delivery note to guarantee 0.5, because up until the end of the year, If you're guaranteeing to meet regulation 14.1, you're only guaranteeing 3.5%. So that's a suggestion, and it's possible to do that. So, moving forward, when the IMO decided we are going for 2020, they started a program of regulatory amendments, consequential regulatory amendments, and to develop guidelines to help the industry have a successful implementation of this. Because we all realize that this is no plain sailing, and enforcement is a concern. And so you've all heard about the carriage ban, I'm sure, and it was adopted at OMPC 73, and it's just a few extra words added to regulation 14.1, which is that the sulphur content of fuel use or carried for use must not exceed 0.5. That led to a few misunderstandings in the market, because people think, well, if I can't carry fuel above 0.5, then what's the point of a scrubber? You can still use the scrubber. That is still an exemption as long as you have the correct certification for that. Some people also thought, now, I can't carry fuel as cargo, because in our industry we talk about fuel as a cargo. No, fuel oil in this context is only the fuel carried on a ship intended to be used for propulsion purposes or as fuel on the ship, so it does not affect the cargo, so don't worry about that. And the ship implementation plan was approved. This is non-mandatory, but it helps ship plan and prepare and demonstrate that they're doing that. There are appendices on impact on machinery systems with some notes on how you can prepare for dealing with a number of different fuel grades. And there's an appendix on tank cleaning, which is going to be a very important part of the work. And IBIA did actually provide the IMO with a document with a lot of detail about manual tank cleaning in dry dock, in operation, and using additives. And substantial parts of that document was used in the IMO's, in this appendix. So I would like to translate that ship implementation plan into 3 P's for ship owners. The first P is prepare the hardware. That installation of scrubbers, if you haven't done that already or got one booked, you're a bit late in the day, but you can always do it if you think it's still profitable after 2020, and people are doing that. And one thing that you really should have thought of as a ship owner is the tank and fuel system configurations. If you have just 2 fuel tanks, or even worse, if you have just 1 fuel tank, you're really not in a good position to deal with fuels which aren't compatible, etc. So if you have just 2 fuel tanks, could you, for example, put your ship into dry dock and separate that into more than 1 tank? And you might need to do other adjustments to your fuel system. Plan for the switch, that's really, really important, the tank cleaning. When are you going to do it? How are you going to do it? And then when are you going to start buying the compliant fuel so that you are compliant on the 1st of January? And practice. There are some operational challenges here. Fuel switching, ships which are already switching in and out of ECAS already have experience in dealing with 2 potentially incompatible fuels, which is great. Not everybody has it, but really knowledge, information, training crew is going to be crucial. And it's not just ship owners that have 3 Ps, but we have them for suppliers as well, at least 3 Ps. The first one being planning, which products to offer and where to source them, because that's going to change dramatically, obviously. The refineries that you use to get your high sulfur fuel from, are they going to produce the 0.5 blends that you need? Not necessarily. So that's going to be a big challenge. Prepare the supply infrastructure. That, again, is a really big challenge. Are you going to have to reallocate tank usage from shore tanks that have previously had high sulfur fuel in them to carry 0.5 fuels? They need to be cleaned out thoroughly. And the same applies to cargo tanks on your barges. What kind of allocations are you going to have there? And again, tank cleaning becomes very, very important. Otherwise, residues of high sulfur fuel could contaminate the product and render it non-compliant. And practice for suppliers as well, developing those new blends, practice it, get it right. Have them tested according to ISO 8217, and where possible, do performance testing in engines, and even better, run trials with ships if you can. That's really important. And in addition, there's the additional P+, which is the biggest challenge for the supply market, which is predict what it is that the customers want, where it is that they want it, like for example high sulphur fuel for ship fuel scrubbers, and when is it that the buying community will start getting these compliant fuels. People have a pretty good idea, but again, you know, it will vary, so it's a tricky one and it makes life challenging. There are a few other challenges along the way, some bumps in the road, if you like, which we have been trying to resolve. Sulphur verification for in-use samples. The fact is that today, Appendix 6 of MARPOL Annex 6 provides a sulphur verification only for the MARPOL sample. But what's been happening with emission control areas is that Port State Control Officers have been taking in-use samples from the ship's fuel system to see what fuel is being used is actually compliant. And recognizing that, the IMO developed guidelines for how to take those samples safely and so that they are representative of what's in use. But there aren't any sulphur verification guidelines for those types of samples, and practices have varied in terms of how authorities have determined that when those are sent for analysis. And we've heard some pretty extreme cases. Most of the time there's good judgment involved and some levels of lenience have been heard, but we've also heard examples of a sample being tested at 0.10245, for example. And of course, if you take all those digits into consideration, then that is not compliant. However, if you round it to 0.2 decimals, that is compliant. And that's how it should be, really. And because there is no clear guidance and there has been options for people to do it differently, this is something that IBIA has tried to address. And at PPR is the Pollution Prevention and Response Subcommittee. It's a subcommittee of MEPC. It's where all the work is done for the MEPC to later then decide on. MEPC being the Marine Environment Protection Committee. So a year ago, we made two new proposals. Let's define sulphur content in the regulation itself, sticking it to the test method, which is the most used by testing agencies to determine sulphur in marine fuels. And also use that reporting protocol, because that would kind of sort things out and bring that uniformity across the board. And also, just so you know, the reporting protocol, any test result above 0.10 is to be reported with just 2 decimals. If it's less than 0.10%, it's with 3 decimals, but then that doesn't really make it non-compliant fuel, so that there's no issue there. Also, we started to fight for applying what we call 95% confidence limits to in-use samples, because they don't actually apply to MARPOL samples, and I'll show you some more detail on that later. And we've had some success, and that definition that we were striving to get included is included, although it only refers to the test method in a footnote. And the Appendix 6 regarding the sulphur verification procedure is under being amended, and to include other types of samples. And definitions have been added to the regulations to describe those samples. One is the MARPOL sample that we already know about, and that's called the MARPOL delivered sample. Then there's the in-use samples, which is the fuel in use on the ship. And then a new category, onboard samples, which is a sample of fuel intended for use on the ship. And this, of course, relates to the carriage ban and the ability to check that the carriage ban is being met. So let's have a look at the current Appendix 6 to MARPOL. I like to describe this in sporting terms, because this is something that everybody can understand. To describe the 95% confidence limit, imagine you have a football goal, you have a really great penalty taker. 95 times out of 100, he will hit that target. However, if only the middle of the goal is the true limit that we're talking about, i.e. 0.5, then what happens with the current Appendix 6 to MARPOL Annex 6 is that if you're testing at exactly where the ball is or in the left half of the goal, everything is fine. If you were to test outside the right goal post, then obviously you're off spec. However, if the test result falls in the right half of the goal, i.e. it's above 0.5, but within the 95% confidence limit, which is up to 0.53 for the test method, and it's got to do with the repeatability of the test method, accuracy of it. Then the average of those two tests from the first laboratory would say, okay, that's a little bit sus, let's have another check on it. So let's take it to a second laboratory, and then the average of all those test results from either one lab or two will have to be in the left half of the goal in order for the marble sample to be considered compliant. Which means that the 95% confidence limit is kind of looked at a little bit, but it's a very strict application of it. So what's happening now is that the amendment, which is up for approval at MEPC 74, is only one laboratory to be used, and the marble sample must be at or below the limit, which means that for the marble sample, the left half of the goal is okay, the right half of the goal is not okay. For the in-use sample, however, 95% confidence does apply, which means that the limit and up to 0.59R, which is the formula for the repeatability, is acceptable. So basically, the whole range of the goal is okay for those in-use and onboard samples. So that's what's on the table at the moment. It hasn't been approved or adopted yet, but that's on the table. And IBIA is trying to perhaps get a slightly different approach, which I can talk to you about individually if you like. Why is this a concern? It's because of sulphur disputes and notes of protest. This is, again, lessons we've seen from the emission control areas. The vast majority of sulphur disputes that we've seen in the market, even today, relates to eco-fuels. The global 3.5 limit isn't really much of a problem, so you don't see that. And then NOP is a note of protest. These are official records sent to the IMO from flag states that says our ships had a test results that indicated that the fuel did not meet the sulphur limit. There was a huge drop in 2015 when the sulphur limit in emission control areas dropped to 0.1. Why is that? It was mainly because marine gas oils tends to come from a supply pool where sulphur is not the blend target, so the sulphur limit is more readily met. Previously, with the 1%, sulphur was a blend target, and the more you try to lower the sulphur, the higher the price goes, and so this is obvious economic reasons for this happening. And the analysis of the notes of protest that's been lodged with the IMO shows that if you applied a commercial ISO 4259 to those cases, only 20% would be true of specs in a commercial case. 80% fell within the 95% confidence margins, so they were just marginally above the limit. And that created a lot of unpleasant communications between ships and suppliers, which is quite unpleasant. And with the 0.5 limit, because of blending, that sulphur off-spec risk increases significantly because sulphur again becomes a blend target. And in order to produce fuel as cheaply as possible, then you have to, the cost goes up. So if I just take you back to this one, basically it means that as a supplier, if you blend to the target, where the ball is in the middle, 0.5, there is a huge risk that the marble sample will fail. So in order to meet, be 95% certain that you're never above the middle of the goal, you actually need to blend to the left goalpost. That needs to be your blend target. So that's something really important to bear in mind. Now, consistent implementation. There's been so much developed, and all this has been developed at PPR 6, which was in February, and it's up then for approval at MEPC in May. And definitions have been added. Distilled marine, residual marine, ultra-low sulfur fuel oil, that's the 0.1 max grades, very low sulfur fuel oil, the 0.5 max grades, and high sulfur heavy fuel oil, which I think is self-explanatory. There's impact on fuel and machinery systems, which gives advice on how to deal with a variety of fuels. Verification issues and control mechanisms. How do you inspect ships? There are some controls on fuel suppliers discussed. How to do the sulfur analysis. And I'm pleased to say that an IBIA proposal to make sure that the 95% confidence limit at least is applied to the in-use sample is in those guidelines, because those amendments to Appendix 6 that I showed you, they don't actually take effect until the middle of 2021. And so we need some guidance on this prior to that, which is why we have included in the consistent implementation guidelines some notes about to see that, let's make sure that port state control give 95% confidence at least to the in-use samples. Fuel oil non-availability. that's been discussed. The IMO has developed now a standard fuel oil non-availability report. And anybody who thinks that this is some kind of loophole, no, not at all. It's a way for a ship to self-report that we are not compliant. Why are we not compliant? We're not compliant because we could not get hold of fuel that is compliant. And so that's self-reporting. It has to be sent to your next port of call and to your flag administration. And the intention is that when that ship comes to a port, that the officials should then take that into consideration as a mitigating circumstance and hopefully treat the ship with lenience. The ship is still non-compliant. It will still get a deficiency mark against it. There's also some notes on information sharing about where these non-availability reports are coming in, where are the phonars coming from. And there's possible safety implications, which the next speaker will give you a lot more detail on. But in regards to what's been discussed at the IMO, safety issues discussed with the 0.5 fuels are all the list that you see there. And we have some advice on it now. But one of the myths that's been going around in the market is that there is no spec for these 2020 blends. Oh, how are we going to deal with that? There's no ISO spec for it. And they won't be safe to use because they're unstable, they won't be compatible with other fuels. You might have non-compliance with the SOLAS flashpoint limit and other quality issues. The fact is that fuels will still have to be blended and tested in accordance with ISO 8217. It will meet those specs. Otherwise, they're not commercially viable. And all of those issues in that list on the left-hand side will be addressed by this, with the exception of compatibility, which is a different beast altogether. Stability and compatibility, just a quick note. Stability is the ability to keep the asphalt tins suspended. If they fall out, you get massive sludge formation, which is really, really difficult to deal with, and you don't want that. Compatibility is what happens when you mix two fuels, two perfectly stable fuels. When you mix them together, it can change the chemistry and it becomes an unstable fuel. So the message is very simple: avoid commingling fuels. How you do that, that can be discussed in more detail, but I haven't got time for that right now, sorry. So with these guidelines, which at MAPL 6, the port state control guidelines, they were developed at PPR 6. Because currently we have the 2009 guidelines. Obviously they need updating because of the new changes. And PPR 6 got pretty far with it, but there's a couple of questions that we didn't manage to find agreement on, which will be discussed further at MEPC 74. First of all, will ships always have to debunker any non-compliant fuels? Say they use the phonar, they arrive in a port and they have some fuel left over because you have a safety margin. Do you always have to debunker that? And this is not a trivial matter. Debunkering is tricky. Ships are designed to receive fuel, not to take it out. Very few ports actually provide debunkering facilities today. So a lot of the countries that say, oh yes, we'll definitely have to debunker, they don't debunker ships today, so they're going to have to start doing that. Can something else be agreed? So those discussions are going to happen at MEPC 74 along with a whole lot of other discussions. And what happens in the case where the bunker delivery note shows that the fuel is compliant, so you have the paperwork that shows I bought compliant fuel, and then you send it for a test and it indicates that the fuel we received was not compliant. What do you do in that case? It's not really a fuel or non-availability report issue because you thought you bought compliant fuel. So those are questions that are still on the table. Now, IMO can't do everything, we know that. Only the 93 Annex 6 signatory states can enforce. Thankfully, that covers the vast majority of world tonnage, almost 97%, and approximately half of all the world's coastal states as well. And indeed, in terms of trade, that's where the vast majority of trade goes. So there isn't many countries that aren't going to be able to enforce this, really, in terms of where ships are flagged and where they are going. So that's not the biggest concern, but the biggest concern is that only the 30 countries with emission control areas or other local or indeed European Union countries with at-birth restrictions have any kind of experience in sulphur limit enforcement so far. So there could be a quite steep learning curve throughout the world on that. Many countries have actually not transposed MAPL Annex 6 into their national laws, which puts into question their ability to actually enforce it in terms of fines or criminal cases. So because if it's not in their national law, how can they actually enforce it? So that's an issue. And in addition, and I'm sure the next speaker will tell you more about this, the ISO is expected to provide a publicly available specification during this year, as soon as possible, but it probably won't be until early in the second half, to help the market deal with the 0.5 blends and how to actually apply the existing ISO 8217 with some extra information. And then there's a joint industry project going on, which was initiated by IBIA and ACIMF to provide guidance on these fuels, both for users and suppliers. And IBIA is part of this joint industry project, along with a number of shipping organizations, and we are hoping to get this document out in August to help everybody prepare both for making the right fuels and using them without trouble. So basically the message is that the industry really needs to prepare and comply. That's the message. Prices, how much is all this going to cost? I'm not going to dwell on this because the next speaker is going to do that for you, but suffice to say there's a wide range of speculations in the market. Some people think maybe one of the forecasts we have seen is that high sulfur fuel would be maybe 300 compared to 650 for gas oil, which of course makes the scrubber very attractive. But what about the price difference between 0.1 and 0.5? If you take a simple blend assumption, it's always overly simplistic, but maybe it's $50. In the Sea Delft study, they thought, oh, the price difference between high sulfur fuel and gas oil will only be about 130, and only about $20 difference between 0.1 and 0.5. And if it's only $20, then the question really is, will you then bother to use a very low sulfur fuel blend if you can have gas oil instead? So, cost. Time's up, but I've already got this left and then I'm done. Cost increase impact. Same amount of fuel will definitely cost more than before. There is no doubt about that. Which means that you will have stress on those credit lines. If you're selling 10,000 tons to a ship, it's going to cost a lot more, and then the credit lines need to be expanded accordingly. Is there enough credit in the market for that? Counterparty risk will then become an issue. What's the financial health of those shipping companies going to be because of this increasing cost? And also, if a supplier has a bad payment, can they survive that? Payment terms. Currently, typically 30 days credit, that's the norm. You can have longer, you can have shorter. Can those 30 days credit terms really survive in this market? That's another question. Will we see consolidation because bigger, stronger, gets bigger and stronger still, and the weaker, the smaller ones fall out, so that's an option as well. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, the supply side, from what we're seeing at the moment, is preparing very low sulfur fuel blends. Why are they doing that? They want to meet the demand at the lowest possible cost, because we all know that shipping companies already are very concerned about very small differences between product prices, so they have been chasing price. Maybe that will change. Meanwhile, the demand side is nervous about this very low sulfur fuel quality, so this is something that's difficult to work out. There's also uncertainty about the extent of scrubber update, how many scrubbers will be in service at the start of this next year, and how quickly will it take off. There is, unfortunately, unless suppliers are very careful in their blending and use a 0.47 as their blend target for the 0.5, there is a huge increased potential for sulfur disputes. And the cost of business will inevitably go up. And as a final note to all of you, don't think there's going to be delay or anything like that. Don't think that the carriage ban taking effect on the 1st of March means that there's a delay to the 1st of March. No. The transition to the global 0.5 cap is now. It's happening this year. You're supposed to be compliant on the 1st of January 2020. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. So I think we got the message that everybody needs to comply. Everybody can comply, but the cost is going to be the biggest factor, I think, that is going to be coming up. And for that reason, we have invited the authority on this, which is Platts. We have invited Eleni Vitalis, who's associate editor for fuel oil for S&P Global Platts, and she will discuss fuel price evolution. Before we do that, we'll try one more time to do the poll. So please get onto your phones. And the question is, what is the price difference between MGO and 0.5 sulfur compliant VLSFO? Will it be less than $20, $20 to $50, $50 to $100, or more than $100? Please vote, and we should have the result on the screen, and Eleni will guide us on that a little bit better with actual facts. Just one more point. If you have any questions, please jot them down or put them into your phone again, and they will all be answered during the panel session at the end. Oh. That's quite amazing. Okay. So I think we got a three-way tie. Yeah. Eleni?
Kalimera, thank you very much to Bunkernet for having me this morning. So 9 months to go before the world's the most drastic shift to hit the shipping industry hits us. It seems quite bizarre to be standing here 9 months before with such a strong fuel oil market at present, but really what's the most clarity that is going to hit the market is from the second half of this year. That is when we'll start to see the change. IMO 2020 doesn't really begin on the 1st of January, it begins before that, especially for the refiners and those big players. You'll start to see the changes in the shipping market from around the second half of this year. Now, what does Associate Editor mean at Platts? I basically do the daily fuel oil assessments, so high sulphur fuel oil, low sulphur fuel oil, and 0.5% fuel oil. So those numbers, whether you're happy or upset with them, you can complain to me. So I'm going to discuss different pricing structures that we've seen for fuel oil and distillates over the last couple of months and what the forward curves are showing. Secondly, I'm going to discuss how the European refining sector is gearing up for 2020. Now, the Mediterranean seems to be very prepared and in a good position, so it's a good place to be standing right now. And what products are set to gain from IMO? This seems to be a relatively obvious answer right now, but actually there's still a few things that seem quite unclear. And finally, what's Platts doing to prepare for IMO 2020 and the 0.5% sulphur cap? So first up, history lesson. This is the Northwest European benchmark for fuel oil, the 3.5% for Rotterdam barges. So a lot of people use this benchmark in order to price bunker fuel in Northwest Europe. Now this is the cash differential to the month one paper structure. So if you look from January 15 to January 2017, you can see the market's very weak. There's a contango structure in the market, and this is largely due to the heavy amounts of fuel oil in the market. Russia was pumping out a lot of fuel oil, and that was really depressing the premiums, keeping earnings low in the fuel oil market if you were active in the fuel oil market. But from January 2017, that's really when things began to change. So Russia hiked its export taxes on fuel oil to equal that of crude, and that incentivized the Russian refiners to upgrade their refineries. So that was taking out a large portion of fuel oil from the market. I say a large portion, Russia has too much fuel oil, it's still a lot of fuel oil. But they were essentially preparing to increase the production of distillates and gasoline. And that's when you began to see more seasonality in the fuel oil market. So you'd see bunker demand in the winter throughout and in the summer throughout the year. And then in the summer months, you'd see that extra boost to the European fuel oil market from Saudi Arabia, the power generation thirst. So they were importing a lot of fuel oil in order to feed their oil-fired plants for air conditioning. Now, 2018, I got told when I joined Platts, in the winter months, go on holiday, put your feet up on the desk. It's boring, it's quiet in the fuel oil market. 2018, I didn't want to leave my desk. There were so many things that I've been told that are counter-seasonal, that were unprecedented, And this is largely due to changing supply factors that weren't really in the picture when we first the IMO sulphur cap was first mandated. So take the Iranian sanctions, the US sanctions on Iran. So Singapore import around 1.2 to 1.4 million metric tons a month of Iranian straight run for the bunker market. Now from May onwards, that meant Singapore were waving their hands, Europe, please give us some fuel oil, we can't take the Iranian fuel oil anymore. So Europe was sending cargoes, extra cargoes to Singapore. On top of this, it was peak Saudi summer air conditioning demand. So Saudi Arabia were taking a lot of European fuel oil, and so you had the bunker demand in Europe, you had Saudi Arabian summer power generation demand, and you had the Iranian sanctions, all factors that the European market wasn't quite ready for. And then people thought, okay, winter, maybe supply will begin to improve, prices will begin to drop, availability will be better in the bunker market. Wrong. October 2018, the most anticipated event of the Northwest European market hit the market. The Exxon coker at Antwerp. Everyone was messaging me all through the year. Is the coker online? When's the coker coming online? Do you know anything? End of October, that's when that coker finally came online. 200,000 metric tons a month of RNG grade fuel oil was taken out of the bunker market. And that's why we saw such a strong backwardation at this point in October last year in the Northwest European market. You had barges going from Antwerp to Rotterdam, Rotterdam to Antwerp in order to meet that shortfall that coker was taking out of the market. January, US sanctions on Venezuela. Another heavy barrel out of the market, another loss for the heavy fuel oil market. But that's why that strength has stayed in the European fuel oil market. Now if you look at the forward curve, let's focus on the pink line or red line at the beginning. So the backwardation is still here. The backwardation is still here in 2019 for the high sulphur fuel oil market, that pink line. We've got 9 months to go. This product is going to be in little demand in 2020, but that strength remains into early 2020. Yes, of course, you would expect the demand to drop, so that backwardated structure is natural, but it's the strength of that structure. Why is that structure so strong? And so now we're coming into Saudi Arabian summer air conditioning demand. That European fuel oil is going to be sent, so we're going to see that backwardated structure stay. That means it's really difficult to store product in tank. But you're at a dilemma. If you are a barge owner or a tank owner, when do you clean your tanks? You're suddenly making money from the high sulphur fuel oil market. You've been waiting to kind of make some premiums, for example, and now you're stuck with a dilemma. Do I move to 0.5? Do I move to MGO? Or do I stay with high sulphur until the last possible moment? So there's a lot of questions that remain in the market. If you take the blue line, that's the 1% fuel oil market. So the 1% fuel oil market is a small market. It's the utility market. It's what's used to keep the lights on in Cyprus, for example. It's around 800 KT of demand a month. Now, the reason that there's such a drastic spike is because 1% fuel oil is going to be an attractive blend stock to produce 0.5% compliant marine fuel. Now, at the moment, if you look at the beginning of that graph, the price spread between 1% fuel oil and 3.5% fuel oil is practically non-existent. Really, really cheap 1% fuel oil because high sulphur has been so strong. But as soon as we approach kind of that second half of this year and continue on into 2020 and 2021, 1% fuel oil is going to have to compete with the marine market. That utility market is going to have to compete with the marine market, and the demand is really, really going to pick up for the fuel. Now let's look at the orange line, gas oil. Gas oil is the big kind of hurrah product that everyone's looking towards. It's going to be the saviour of IMO 2020. It's going to be a distillate-based future. The gas oil structure is completely flat. It shows kind of no representation to what's happening in terms of IMO 2020. Now, naturally, you would expect, okay, towards the end of this year, we should sink into a contango structure in order to incentivize storage. And then maybe from kind of February, March 2020, our analysts at Platts forecast that we should see a backwardated structure as the demand for gas oil begins to pick up. But right now, that forward curve is really not reflecting what we're expecting to see happen in the market. So if you look at this on a flat price basis, gas oil's become the blue line and high sulphur fuel oil is the pink line. Gas oil on a flat price basis in the coming months is far more expensive than high sulphur fuel oil. Now, we don't have a forward curve for 0.5%. Hopefully that will be coming soon, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But in terms of if you're looking at this on a flat price basis and you're a ship owner, you're thinking, gosh, I'm really going to have to cough up a lot more money in order to be able to keep my ship going in 2020. But over the last couple couple of weeks, I've been meeting a variety of ship owners, bunker suppliers, for instance, and they've said, initially, we're going to focus on MGO. MGO is a tried and tested product. People know what they're getting. Okay, yes, if you're a ship owner, your vessel probably isn't designed to run on MGO for a long period of time. You might need to buy some extra lubes, etc. But initially, MGO is that kind of safe bet. We don't know what's going into those 0.5% blends. It would be lovely if the refiners came out and said to us exactly what is in those products, but there is still a lot of lack of clarity in the market today. Hopefully, once we have the 0.5% curve, we can see a little bit more of a price incentive, but kind of Platts Analytics estimate that the spread between high sulfur fuel oil and gas oil will be $320 a metric ton in 2020. And just based on that poll earlier, that was quite interesting to see the spread. The people I've been speaking to in the market think that $50 a metric ton for VLSFO below MGO is too small. That spread is going to have to be further apart in order to incentivize owners to use 0.5% fuel or VLSFO. So if we look at the forecast from our analytics team, you can see that the spread between high sulfur fuel oil and low sulfur fuel oil is expected to widen drastically. So the pink line is the Northwest European benchmarks for 3.5% and 1%, and the blue line is the US Gulf Coast benchmarks for 3% and 1%. Now that price spread widens drastically to around $200 a metric ton towards the middle of next year. But then it stabilizes. The calm and the storm has kind of terminated. I mean, the initial panic, yes, okay, we're going to see that huge thirst and huge panic looking for the compliant fuels, but eventually the market will stabilize. So how's Europe prepared in the refining world for IMO 2020? Now, as I mentioned earlier, Russia is the main kind of controlling sector of the European structure of fuel oil. Russia is that main powerhouse. Now, with the falling exports that we saw from Russia, this has really contributed to the stronger structure in the European fuel oil market. 2015, we saw 55 million metric tons of Russian fuel oil exported. That number fell to 30 million metric tons in 2018. Now that's a stark difference, but it's nowhere quite close to zero. For example, take Rosneft. Rosneft are not going to finish their modernization program until 2025. That's still a lot of fuel oil that we're going to see in the market coming out from Russia. Yes, perhaps they could use it domestically if the price is attractive enough, but still, Russia's going to have a lot of fuel oil, and that's where we are going to see the price discounts for high sulfur come in. If high sulfur fuel oil is cheap enough, we're going to see the problem of sulfur be passed from the marine industry to the power generation industry. It's going to be attractive in power stations. So I've showed this slide at a couple of conferences before, but just in terms of by way of update, looking at Rotterdam and Antwerp. Rotterdam is the world's second largest bunker hub. It is geared to produce high sulfur fuel oil. That market is focused on providing high sulfur fuel oil bunkers. So the Rotterdam market has really had to prepare for IMO 2020. It's had to scramble to ensure that there is going to be enough compliant fuel so they remain on their top pedestal as a bunker hub. So you've got that Exxon coker I mentioned earlier, the SDA at Antwerp, Shell's Total's SDA, Shell's SDA. All of these new units are limiting the production of high sulfur fuel oil and increasing the production of more valuable products like the distillates, for example. But what's interesting in Rotterdam is that despite this backwardated structure that we're seeing, the tanks are full. The contracts for tanks in Rotterdam and Antwerp, they've already been taken. Despite this backwardation, the market is willing to take on this expense in order to ensure that they have enough 0.5% fuel and storage for 0.5% fuel, whether to blend it or to have it as a finished product in 2020. So they're willing to take on that expense. Tanks in Rotterdam at various tank owners, I can't say who sadly, but they've begun to interconnect their tanks with different lines. So they've begun to connect the fuel oil tanks with the distillate tanks in order to blend. And that cleaning process has started today. For example, I was speaking to a barge owner the other day, and he said that he was cleaning his barge. He hasn't cleaned it for a long time. He said there was 50 to 60 centimeters of sludge at the bottom of his barge, and he had to physically get a pickaxe and actually kind of smash it all up, pick it up with his hands and dispose of it. You need to be prepared in order to clean your barges and your tanks well ahead of 2020, because it's not an easy process. It's not an overnight process. Now, what's interesting as well about this chart is that you've got Gunvor and BP who have not upgraded. Now, Gunvor initially, they were going to upgrade, they were going to install a delayed coker like Exxon, but they came out and said, no, due to changing economic conditions, we are not going to install this coker anymore. Now, Gunvor and BP are going to be really attractive to those owners that have scrubbers. Rotterdam is still going to have high sulphur fuel oil. Rotterdam's going to have 0.5. Rotterdam's going to have MGO. These bunker hubs, as Uni said earlier, they will have the three fuels that you need, four fuels perhaps, if you're looking at a 0.5% residual blend and a 0.5% distillate blend. But let's take the Mediterranean. Now, in the fuel oil market, typically the Mediterranean, the West Mediterranean has relied on imports from the Black Sea and from Northwest Europe. The West Mediterranean has always kind of been balanced to short high sulphur fuel oil in terms of the bunker market, because that's where the bunker demand lies. But what is so interesting about 2020 is that the West Mediterranean refiners are really, really confident that they are going to be able to supply 0.5% to their own market, to their own kind of demand centre, but also further afield. So this typical short that we've seen in the fuel oil market is no longer going to be there. Instead, we're going to see different flows. Are we going to see flows from the West Med, for example, to Latin America? Latin America has a lot of heavy sour crudes. Chile, are we going to see 0.5% fuels produced in Chile? Probably not. So are these fuels from the West Med going to be arbed, or for example from Houston down to other regions of the world? So it really is a refiner's game. A lot of ship owners, for example, they're confident they'd rather go to a refiner than a blender to take that 0.5% fuel, because that refiner has produced it in his refinery, so he has straight run fuel and it's gone straight to his tank. There's no messing about with traders in between. Take Malta, for example. Malta is a blending hub. Now, Malta is a really, really popular port today. You don't have to pay the port dues. You can take large vessels, for example. But it's a blending hub. You're going to have a lot of different concoctions of 0.5% fuel. If you're visiting Malta, for example, in early 2020, what fuel are you going to get compared to if you go to, say, Lisbon and visit Galp, or Algeciras and visit Cepsa? Now, the fuels that the Mediterranean refiners have been producing are very close to the RMG spec that we know today, the ISO specification. They're 0.5% sulphur with a 370, 380 CST viscosity. That's pretty good considering that you're focusing on sulphur. Now, again, as Uni said, we're waiting for the ISO to release its next specification, the next indicator to the market. So it's all very well that these refiners have been blending to 0.5% specifications based on today's knowledge, the RMG grade that we know today, the ISO 8217. But what happens when they release a new specification? What happens if there's a parameter for something random like calcium that they weren't expecting? They have to go back to the drawing board. So if you're a ship owner, if I'm Eleni Vessels, or whatever you want to call me, and I go to Cepsa today and I say, please can I test your 0.5% fuel? Say yes, I'm happy with Cepsa's product, all good, I sign my contract, and I go and take my first delivery in October this year. That product could be completely different in October because, say, Cepsa had to take a different stream because of crude, firstly, but also because ISO may and hopefully have released their new specification. So it's a very, very difficult time. It's all very well saying a lot of ship owners will be looking at contracts in 2020, but there's this big kind of hole that we still need to fill as we get closer to 2020. So changing global refining capacity. On the whole, without even realising, the refining sector has been gearing up for 2020 and to provide compliant fuels and also a more distillate light end based future for a long time. If you look at the chart from 2010 to 2014, that secondary capacity, that complex refining capacity, has been increasing for a long period of time. And then you had the announcement, the official announcement in 2016 that the sulphur cap was happening, and the refining capacity did pick up, but that big change that we saw really happened between 2010 and 2014. So we have been essentially gearing up for this process for a while. So these are the existing fuel oil trade flows that we know today. So if you look at the heavy black lines, they are the flows from Russia and from Europe to Singapore, the world's largest bunker hub. You can see some flows to the Middle East. You can see some flows to Africa for power generation. Now, these flows, what's going to happen in 2020? As I mentioned earlier, the West Med seem to think that they're going to be balanced along 0.5. Are we going to see new arbitrages flowing from the West Med down to Latin America if freight is favourable? Are Singapore still going to want high sulphur fuel oil in 2020 from Europe? That arbitrage for Singapore high sulphur fuel oil is going to close at some point. We're going to see that kind of profitable flow that has supported the European fuel oil market dwindle away. Now, whilst we might see 5 cargoes of 5 VLCCs a month or so go to Singapore, the expectation is that come Q3 this year, those VLCC flows of high sulphur fuel oil are going to begin to slow down. And that's when we'll start to see the change in the fuel oil market. And will Singapore continue to import high sulphur fuel oil because they have a lot of distillate and are able to produce 0.5%? We don't know the answer, sadly. So if you look at the crack values, kind of early 2018 and before, that makes sense. That's what you learn at school, that's what you learn in a book, that's what you learn at university. From April or July 2018 onwards, that makes no sense. Why is that happening? What on earth is going on? Why is fuel oil pricing at the same or similar values to gasoline? The reason that naphtha isn't on here is because that's a cargo crack and I'm reflecting barge cracks. But fuel oil was pricing above naphtha. Now the reason is because we've had such a diverse kind of change in the crude slates. You've had the sanctions, as I mentioned earlier, on 2 heavy barrels, the Venezuelan barrel and the Iranian sanctions. Despite some waivers in the market, that has supported the European fuel oil crack. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Asian arbitrage will close eventually and the fuel oil crack will soften. But there's no reason why that fuel oil crack won't stay strong for the next couple of months, because you've got that Saudi thirst for fuel oil, that Saudi summer air conditioning demand, which will prop up that demand. And we're not quite at 2020 yet. Gasoline is expected to recover. I'm just going to jump slides. So this is the forecast from our analytics team. Over the next couple of months, gasoline is expected to recover. You have the change to the summer specification. You've got refinery maintenance, for example, and US driving season. But also what's interesting about the gasoline market is that gasoline, obviously you take VGO and you run it through your FCC to produce gasoline. VGO is an attractive blend stock for the 0.5% pool. Now, VGO is in plenty of supply. Those tanks are full right now. But as we get closer to 2020, those low sulphur VGOs that are pretty nice to produce a nice 0.5% residual blend, they might be taken away from the gasoline pool, and that might lift some support to the gasoline market. But our analysts forecast that high sulphur fuel oil cracks will drop to minus $25 a barrel in 2020, and diesel will become positive $25 a barrel in 2020. Now, who knows what Trump is going to tweet tomorrow, but based on everything being stable and there's no more sanctions, for example, imposed, that's the picture that we're expecting to see at Platts. So what products are set to gain from IMO? So naturally, you can see that there's going to be increased production of lighter products. So we've got a lot of new refining capacity coming online. You've got the Jazan refinery, you've got the 3 refineries in Asia, you've got the refinery in Malaysia. I can't pronounce any of these, that's why I'm not naming them, but I'm happy to speak to you afterwards about them if you would like. So that's increasing the yield of those lighter, more valuable products. Middle distillates, that's going to be a thirst. There's going to be a thirst for middle distillates for the marine pool. And also, the vacuum residue pool is going to be dwindling. Now, I sit on the fuel oil desk. Am I still going to have a job in the middle of next year? I don't know. Maybe I'll be joining the distillates team, but hopefully I'll still have a job. So let's take the demand. So today, 3.6 million barrels a day of high sulphur fuel oil bunker demand. Now, the first 600,000 barrels a day is going to go to scrubbers and non-compliance. I think the estimates are very similar. The IEA says around 700,000 barrels a day. So the numbers are pretty similar that are floating around there. I'm going to talk a little bit more about scrubbers afterwards. But that leaves 3 million barrels a day of high sulphur fuel oil bunkers that need to find a home. So the first 2 million barrels a day are going to come from gas oil blends for 0.5. So we need to find that gas oil in the market. Asia seems to be pretty good in terms of distillates. The US, they've seemed to be pretty set for their refining capacity. Europe, the Mediterranean, which was a kind of initial concern, seems to be ready for 0.5% in terms of their blends. Northwest Europe, it still seems to be a little bit of an answer, but they're ready. The refiners are ready, they've upgraded, but in terms of actually seeing those products, we still have yet to see those products in the market. Now the remaining 1 million barrels a day, so the first 2 million is coming from gas oil 0.5% blends. The remaining 1 million barrels a day are going to come from 1% blends. So those 1%, that 1% fuel oil with low sulphur straight run, low sulphur VGO, for example. Now, whilst it's all very well saying that I've tested a nice 0.5% residual blend today, you've probably been offered a product which has got 0.2, 0.3% low sulphur VGO or whatever product it is. They're very, very low sulphur contents. As we get closer to 2020, the demand of these products is going to pick up. The price of these products is going to pick up. Are they going to be as readily available? Is your refiner that you've been speaking to still going to have access to those streams in 2020? So again, you might have been testing a product today, but it might be a little bit different as we get closer to 2020. So what is our forecast? So let's start with the distillates chart. So the distillates column in 2020, you can see that means that 0.5% distillate-based fuel is going to be 40% of the market. 0.5% residual-based fuel is going to be 45% of the market. High sulphur fuel oil, no scrubbers, that's a polite way of saying non-compliance, around 5%. And high sulphur fuel oil scrubbers, around 6%. So initially, that demand for 0.5% fuel will be very, very great. But if you jump to 2025, the thirst for that product is going to dwindle a little bit. We get to 45% again, still for 0.5% sulphur. But that distillate 0.5% blends, that drops to 28% as more people take on scrubbers. Now, if we just look at scrubbers in 2020, I'm aware of the time. The Platts Analytics forecast is that on the 1st of January 2020, there'll be 2,200 scrubbers in the market. By the end of January, this number will be 3,000. Now, that's a very small portion of the fleet, as we said, around kind of 6% of the fleet. As scrubbers become more attractive and the price is there, more people are going to want to install scrubbers. For example, I was telling some of the members of the audience last night that I was speaking to a ship owner the other day, and he said, I went to go and visit some scrubber shipyards, some scrubber companies in November, and I said, please can I have some scrubbers for my vessels? And 4 of them said no. No surprise, the scrubber order book is full ahead of 2020. That's all what we've been told. In March, he had those 4 scrubber retrofitting companies knock on his door and say, I have a scrubber for you, I can install it this quarter. So there seems to be a little bit of a change in the wind about the idea of scrubbers. So maybe people have begun to back out of this scrubber kind of sphere. But there is a saturation point in the market. So our analytics team estimate that 6,000 scrubbers is the maximum that you can have in the market in order to make back your payment on your investment and also the price spread between MGO and high sulphur, or 0.5% fuel and high sulphur. Sorry. So what are Platts doing to prepare for 2020? Sorry, I'll probably send you to sleep in this bit. But basically, we've been trying to prepare for 2020 for a while. So we've been speaking to the market for a long time about what specifications are out there and what assessments we need to reflect. As many of you are aware, we had launched our 0.5% assessments for Fujairah, Singapore, Rotterdam and the US on the 2nd of January this year. Now that specification that we're reflecting is ISO 8217-2010. The only thing that we have is 0.5% sulphur. I must have spoken to about 100 companies face-to-face and said, what specification should we reflect in our 0.5% sulphur assessments? And they said, all that you can do is 0.5% sulphur because we don't know. And yes, okay, some people are going to have a distillate grade, 0.5%, and yes, some people are going to have a 0.5% residual grade. But Platts don't lead the market, we have to follow what the market is doing. So once there is more indications from the market, yes, we can look at, say, looking at launching new assessments and stuff, but right now this is the information we have in the market. So let's look at this on a flat price basis. You can see that we have assessments for Singapore, for Rotterdam, Fujairah, as I mentioned, and the US. So let's look at the light blue, light grey line. So you can see that in the end of February, that price for that grey line dropped dramatically. Now, why is this? Why did this value drop so drastically? Because I was at a party in IP Week, and I got a message on my phone, and it said, "We've had the first trade in our 0.5% assessment process." So that was a 0.5% barge sold from Shell to Motiva, and it was delivered recently, and we've had another trade since. But that price spread was so much narrower than the indications we had been receiving from the market. That trade was around $20 to $30 a metric ton above high sulphur fuel oil. Now, 0.5% fuel, it's going to be a product that is far more valuable than the 3.5% we know today. But as I said, it's 9 months to go. This is a physical assessment today. There is limited demand in the market for this product. There is limited availability. And not many people have cleaned their infrastructure in order to receive this 0.5% product. So that's why the price spread is narrower. And you can see on this chart that 0.5% marine fuel in Rotterdam, which is the pink line, is pricing very, very close to that of a straight run value, a 0.5%, 0.7% straight run value. And it's around $50 a metric ton above high sulphur fuel oil. Now, there is no doubt that this price spread will increase as we go forward. Now, ship owners have said to me, okay, if that's the price that you're reflecting in your MOC, I'm going to come in, I'm going to clean my tanks, I'm going to flush my lines, and I'm going to come and bid for this product and store it. And we know that there is a company in offshore Malta that are building their inventories of 0.5%. But it takes time to clean this product, it takes time to clean your tanks. So whilst we are publishing these numbers, and people do think the price spread is narrow, it's because we're still 9 months to go. As soon as we get to the second half of this year, there is no reason why the demand for this 0.5% product will pick up. And also we can begin at looking to launch a Mediterranean assessment. So I know that a lot of the bunker industry in the Mediterranean prices off the FOB Med cargoes or the CIF Med cargoes, for example. The reason we can't launch a cargo assessment today is because that's 30 KT of fuel oil. Until, say, Repsol or somebody comes to me and says, I have 30 KT of product in my tank, and then somebody in Malta says, yes, I can receive 30 KT of product in my tanks, fine, we can look at launching an assessment. But is that infrastructure there today? Not yet. So this is the Singapore cargo window. I'm not sure how clearly you can see this, but basically this is the market on close process. On the offer side, you've got Repsol and Mitsui, and on the bid side, you've got BP. So the Singapore market has been more active than the other regions of the world because you have the Chinese ECA of the 0.5%. You have the mini IMO in 2019. So China has got demand for cargo sizes of 0.5% fuel, and that's where we're seeing the real indications and the real kind of direction of the market. In terms of futures, so this is where the swaps come in. So we've had ICE who launched their futures contracts in February this year, and CME who launched theirs in December. And we've seen the first trades on the spreads, and we're still seeing trades today. So the indications that you can see at the bottom left-hand corner, those are trades. That's the trade of the premium of 0.5% fuel over 3.5% fuel, or the spread of the high five spread, as the brokers seem to be calling it. And it's for a calendar 2020 contract. Now, the first trade was done at $160 a metric ton. So they were saying that in calendar 2020, the premium of 0.5% fuel will be $160 over 3.5% fuel. Now, people said that was a little bit low. We're now seeing higher trades at like $188 a metric ton, and brokers are calling it's going to be 200 soon. Now that we're seeing this liquidity in this assessment process, we can now look at launching a swaps assessment. Now, I don't have an official date that we will be launching it, but May this year is when we will be launching our swaps assessment. So you'll start to see a forward curve for 0.5% fuel being built and reflecting where the market is seeing value, and that can hopefully provide more clarity on where the price of 0.5% fuel will be in 2020 and beyond. And we're also launching a 0.1% DMA assessment for ARA. That may seem a little bit late to start launching an eco-fuel based assessment, but this was the call of the market, and we have to speak to different participants in the market, and I'll speak to you more about that if you want to know that afterwards. But thank you very much, and I'm aware I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleni. That was fantastic. Thank you very much. Now, we need to move to the technical side. We have Phobos with us today, who is an industry leader in analysis. They have released quite a few bulletins, and these were based on the considerations for using the new 2020 fuels. Naim Javid is with us, who is the operations manager of Global Phobos. So, the poll question is, what do you see as the biggest fuel management challenge? The stability, the compatibility, or other quality issues such as cat fines, flash point, or cold flow properties? Please vote. Okay, I think it's pretty clear. Compatibility issues are going to be very, very important. Let's see what Phobos has to say.
Kalvera, good morning, and thanks to Bunkernet for inviting us to share our thoughts. We'll be okay. I'll be talking about mostly about the more focused technical implications of the fuels and what we have learned so far and what we can do to mitigate those risks. Because we know that, as we have seen from the last two speakers, the quality of the fuel is not yet known. And as a ship owner, we are facing the dilemma that we have to prepare our high-valued assets against some unknowns. So at the outset, actually, this question looks really very frustrating, to say the least. But being a technical person, we know that there are few things which we can do to at least mitigate some of the risks, if not all. And those risks even involve costs. We have no control about the pricing of the fuel, but we have control on the repercussions of not managing those unexpected fuels on board. So this is a mix and match. So I would like to actually portray a positive image, what we can do against the unknowns. This is the data overall. This is not most up to date, but this gives us the trend that irrespective of the uptake of scrubbers, it should not be called scrubbers, exhaust gas cleaning systems, yes, because they're worth millions, their take-up and towards the end LNG take-up as well, it will not actually be to an extent which will impact largely on the marine fuel market. So we have to rely and we have to be fully prepared to face this the 0.5% fuels challenge. Even if we have the scrubbers fitted on board, there may be some ports where the high sulfur fuel oil may not be available. So still, if you have a scrubber even, then and you don't have actually control on the supply chain and you are not entering in the long-term contracts, then it is advisable that you prepare yourself for the very low sulfur fuel oil as well, because it is very important from the compliance perspective. So this is just data from third party. The thing which actually struck me is there is a consistent non-compliant to start, and it goes for a few years. And this is one data input, and as we have seen from the Platts, and there are other organizations which tells us the similar thing, that there will be some 5 to 10% of the non-compliant that may be intentional, but looking at attending the IMO meetings, it will be difficult for those ships to operate in the Europe or in the Americas or in some other countries as well, despite there are lack of resources on the checks and verifications. One other thing from this graph, and this is consistent with all other data inputs, that the compliant fuels entering into 2020 will not be like 100% very low sulfur fuel oils. It will see it's approximately 50-50 split between the gas oils, the very safe option, and the very low sulfur fuel oils. There may be different reasons to that. Again, one thing, as I said earlier, that even if a lot of ships are taking scrubbers on board and fitting with LNG, but their total impact is not more than 1 million barrel per day, and the total fuel consumption is approximately 4 million barrel per day. So still, there is a huge 3 million barrel per day of the fuel oils that needs to be consumed and supplied to the marine industry, and that's where our focus is. Just a quick roundup, because it's important when you talk about the quality of the fuels and talk about preparing yourself or your assets against the unknowns. It's important to know what has happened at IMO. Uni has kindly actually gone through all this, but I'll just go through some specifics. First of all, the fuel oil non-availability report. There was some discussions about the technical implications that you can still put a FONA report based on the technical implications, stating that your ship, it is not safe for your ship to load that fuel. But unfortunately, after a lot of discussions, incompatibility, which was seen as a biggest concern, or stability, were not considered those technical aspects which could be used to lodge the non-availability report. Mainly because these are the things which can be dealt, if not 100%, to a larger extent, with the proactive ship implementation planning, and to understand and to configure your fuel systems and bunkering strategies according to the 2020 risks. That's one of the very, very important things, because if some ships find themselves that due to real safety reasons, they are unable to load compliant fuel, still they need to demonstrate that what they did about a year ago, for example, now, to identify those technical implications, to identify the limitations of the machinery, of the systems, and what they did to mitigate those. If you can successfully, for example, demonstrate that we identified, for example, our boiler system cannot use very low sulfur, very low viscosity fuels, and at some port we procured 0.5%. We tried to procure, but its viscosity was less than 5 centi-stroke at 50 degrees. So, and we have been in contact with the boiler manufacturers, and we have tried our best to get these things, the repaired or the right equipment fixed, but they had no slot. So that kind of stuff, which is actually can be backed hugely by your proactiveness and your preparation, that may be acceptable for the limited period. But if you find out that you have one tank or an engine, or you don't have heating capacity, and you are loading a little bit of high viscosity fuel, that may put you in trouble. So that's the clear message which we give to our clients as well when we talk about the preparedness about the 2020, that technical implications, as we have seen in the press, that it is portrayed as a loophole, but it is not a loophole. Those people who have attended these IMO meetings, they know that it was put intentionally, and they really mean it, that they are going to listen to the ship's genuine problems, but to think about that these can be used or misused, I think it's not realistic. And a little bit on the non-availability and non-compliant. So what at PPR 6 was discussed is the non-compliant intentional or non-intentional. For example, even if you lodge fuel oil non-availability report, you are not complying to MARPOL Annex 6 regulation for the sulfur cap, but you are also not complying to the sulfur, high sulfur carriage ban. So there are two things. And then for the carriage ban, they may actually take more stricter actions. There have been some discussions about, to allow ships to sail to the next port, to allow ships to use it after mixing it, to allow ships to take some other actions and keep it on board for the next 6 months or so. But that all were, heavily debated, and I really doubt, personally, sensing the mood at PPR 6, that any port states, even at the MEPC 74, will allow carrying of that. And this is specifically not a good, news for the ship operators, because if you travel from A to B, and with the current situation of the global warming and unexpected weather conditions, you should have a lot of, a safety margin on the fuels. But what that safety margin will be, if it is 200 tons, if it is 10 tons, if it is 50 tons, then that is a real question, that once you load it and you are fully compliant, you are fully complying the law by putting the FONA, but still your judgment about the safety margin can be penalized. So that's a tricky question. I think that should be, we hope that should be clarified in MEPC, but looking at the historical developments, I think that we should prepare ourselves for such eventualities, especially in our planning, what we will do in such cases, how we will limit our risks. Maybe we have to a little bit change the voyage or change the bunkering plan to avoid that, unexpected to happen. So the big questions about the cost and everything is there, but now we focus only on the two things: what is the adaptability of the systems and the people, and the quality of the fuels. These are two interlinked things. If we know the quality of fuel, then it's easy for us to go and fix our systems. But if we don't know the quality of fuel, then we are only left with the fuel systems and training of the people. And that's the only thing which we can focus more and more today. And I think that with the run-up to 2020, in the second half of this year, we'll have more clear ideas about the quality of the products that may be available across the globe. We still see and we still analyze very low sulfur fuel oils. Most of them are, by the nature of the refining and by the nature of their the crude slate and what sweet crude or they use. So in South America, we know that there are few ports that historically have always supplied low sulfur fuel oil like 0.2, 0.3. But my question now is, because that sulfur was supplied as a high sulfur fuel oil and that product could not be actually used or sold at the premium rate, but now we expect that products will be transported or somehow moved across the different parts of the globe. So it may be that the products which we see now in South America, which is very, very good, may not be that or may not be that much available in that part of the world. Specifically, when we talk about this very low sulfur fuel oil, we have a very live example of China, where they have implemented 0.5% regulation, and they are supplying 0.5% fuel. So that actually, when we look at the 0.5% sulfur fuels, the Chinese samples, their quality data gives us more clues than what we test from the South America or maybe from West Africa as well. This is just realizing the fact that there have been some rumors and there is an ambiguity in the market. We have started plotting all the data. Now it's available on the LR website, so anybody can go and check this data, availability of the different fuels, and not only the availability of the fuels, also the quality of those fuels as tested by us. We will also actually input the ports where the fuel is available based on the news only, but we will mention that this is based on the market information, but where the quality data is displayed, it will be the data analyzed by LR. So if you look at when we talk about the very low sulfur fuel oils, it is not some rocket science. It is not something that we can give you a golden bullet to actually resolve all your problems. We need to go to the basics. And when we talk about the people on how to manage these fuels, the first thing we say that you start to unlearn your accumulated knowledge in your head about how you treat the fuels, because every single blend may be quite different to the others. For example, if you see the data from China or overall this data, irrespective of what you order, that should be according to the ISO 8217, but what you get can be completely different. Your viscosity can be like as low as 10 or as high as 400 something. So when you have such high viscosity range, and that's also true for the density as well, and that's also true for other parameters as well, then you are not you are not supposed to follow your historical stored data, especially when you are managing the fuels on board. You need to look at each product individually, and you need to get as much information as possible before loading, so that you can even store it in an appropriate way. Same is true for the pour point, although actually ISO put some limits to the pour point of 30, but a hypothetical scenario, you go to a port, you order RME 380, that is perfectly fine, but they say, by the way, my pour point is 45. So I don't think so that is a point where you can issue fuel and non-availability report unless you have done your work before and you have checked what you can do against that risk, and you are right on the path to mitigate that. So unfortunately, that kind of stuff, which is real as happening now, and we see that it will only can get worse because there will be more pressure on the supply chain. The interesting thing, which is normally not actually discussed mainly in the market, but what our data shows also, that cat fines which are getting a little bit more bigger risk once again, because the data at the back side is the cat fines averages from Phobos analysis in 2017-18, and the gray bars shows the data of the very low sulfur fuel oil and the cat fines. And you see that there are more instances of higher number of cat fines than lower number of cat fines. So it means that with the very low sulfur fuel oil, it is possible that you get maybe not 2010 grade, maybe 2005 grade, but again, based on this, it is difficult, on almost impossible to lodge the fuel oil non-availability report. So with compatibility, stability is good, but we need to actually be more focused on these cat fines as well. And talking to the various industry stakeholders relative to a refinery, they also say the same, that okay, they cannot guarantee about the cat fines will be lower because it will be a light product now. So it will be within the specification, yes, of course, of ISO specifications, but it can be up to IT, and if you see you have more instance of more than 50, then it's very difficult to get that removed through normal onboard treatment. Another important thing is the viscosity-density relationship, and that affects the CCAI. And with the various different blends, maybe CCAI may not be that relevant, but the ignition and combustion is still a question on the new products. And what we advise to our clients, there are two ways of looking at things, yes? One way is we say that, okay, whenever you load the new product, and as part of your ship implementation plan and to limit your risks, you start using it on the 2 strokes, and if everything goes right, then start using it on 4 stroke. But there are people who say, yeah, we will directly go and use it on 4 stroke. If it works well, then 2 strokes will not be a problem. So, but there is an issue on that as well that we need to be aware of, that with the new blends, this ignition and combustion characteristics, that may not be rightly called CCI because they will be different blends, but that can be an issue. So, what we think is the main problems is the tanking and the fuel system configuration. If that is done, in our opinion, about 90% of the risks or 90% of the concerns about the quality can be dealt by simply working on your tanking arrangements and the piping arrangements. This is equally true because even today, for some ships, what we identified is if you have a forward tanks, deep tanks in the forward of the ship, and your pumps may not be able to transfer that fuel from the forward, because maybe the viscosity you get is very low. It's not 380, it's not 180, it may be 5. But that fuel is compliant. That is rather good for you, because you need less heating to make it go to the engine. But will your pumps, will your transfer arrangements capable of transferring those? That's a question, and that should be actually, in our opinion, is a real question, and that should be tackled when you are planning the transition. Equally oppositely, if you have very high pour point, and all the tanks are capable of heating that to a little bit more than above average levels, because I know I'm a seafarer and I know that it's difficult to get tank temperature more than 35, 40 in extreme cases, yes, and also it's not a wise use of energy. But what you can do if you get high pour point, very fine fuel, that will be fantastic in all other terms, but how you are going to manage it? What if you have high pour point fuel and very low viscosity fuels? So it can be tricky as well. So the problem is not only the tanking, but also the tanking with the heating and no heating. So that's a multiple thing, and also the transfer lines. If it's running through the deck, then in cold weather conditions, what can happen to them? As the other things I talked about, the main important thing is about cylinder lube oil and the lube oil generally. We have seen, and there is at least one lube manufacturer that say that you may still have to have high BN fuel lubes as well. That we recommend that you run your engines on high BN fuel once a week. Yes. So it's not only that you only need to talk about or concerned about the quality of the fuel, but all the relative ripple effect, all the things which comes under the ripple effect. It may be that you still have to have two type of lubes, cylinder lubrication. One is low BN and the high BN as well, and then you need to make a plan together with the engine manufacturers when to switch and how much to switch, because these are all interlinked. What we found out, another thing is that, for example, a simple thing like viscosity, it's normally they are not working, and in my experience, we never used to, look at them in that detail with that interest, because it was always, if it's not 380, it is 320 or it is 390, but almost the right temperature will bring the viscosity of the fuel in the right frame to enter the engine and run the engine. But with the new type of fuels, your sensing of the viscometer or your feedback to the heating or cooling may not be that effective. And then what you do? We suggest that this needs to be taken into consideration, and any alternative arrangements must be made. For example, there are various calculators available on board online, and also we also have the calculator. Then you need to cross-check with that if it doesn't work, then how can I cross-check and adjust the viscosity? Because a simple thing like viscosity can wreck the engines. It's enough if it's not correct. So there are definitely a few things which we can do, but we also suggest that to put focus on the training of the people, because that's really important. That if we have served on board, you may have experienced that when you are working in the engine room, in the machinery space, fuel is not really the first and topmost priority for you. You only go to the purifier room if it overflows or if something happens. And above all, it's a machinery, it's a machine, it is running, you have no clue about it, that whether it is running fine, it is not running fine, it is doing its work or not. So that's the kind of stuff we need to put back into the minds of the engineers on board, and not only engineers on board, but the whole people related to the ship management, that We need to be aware of, first of all, the fuels, its related risks, and the variance that can happen, and that will happen definitely, and how it will affect your operational profile maybe, and how it affects your maybe efficiency. There may be an issue with the energy content of the fuel. So there are different aspects, and apart from machinery, we need to focus also on the people management. Yes, let's talk about some of the specific concerns. ISO 8217 working group is working really, really hard to develop something for the industry which will benefit owners, operators, and also benefit the fuel suppliers in the supply chain to understand the risks. The only difference which was in the past and in the future is, in the past you may go away with only the transactional relation. You go, you search for the right fuel, and whoever is cheapest, if it is the RMG 380 grade fuel, you go and you take it. But as part of going transition to 2020, we strongly suggest that you sit with the intended supplier, you discuss with them, maybe you discuss in more detail what are your operational constraints, what are your machinery constraints, what are your technical implications, and how they can address that. I've seen compatibility is seen as a fuel quality spec, but with all due regard to the ship's operations, because we represent owners, but compatibility of the fuels is definitely not a quality parameter which should be tackled or concerned by the supplier. Okay, they can give you assurance if it is the same supplier, but I really doubt that as well, because they may not have control on the products which they supply in different parts of the world, even in the same part in different time zones. So it's really tricky, and that's why it's important we go back to the drawing board and see what I can do to keep the fuels segregated. If I can't do, what should I do? Should I bunker more oftenly? No. Okay. Should I take some extra gas oil, to run for the interim period? How would I do? And if I have some issues, how will I tackle it? How will I keep my ships running? How I will ask charterers in my charter parties that please give due regard to these parameters, because that's important. Only RMG 380 ISO 8217 spec may not be enough. It will still be compliant, but it may still give you operational problems. So cold flow properties, as we see that about 40 to 50% of the shipping will go to the gas oil as a compliant option. So there will be a pressure on the gas oil supply, and not necessarily on maybe the pressure, but to increase the profits, there may be some strange blends which we have seen in the past as well that may come, and that may complicate the issue of the gas oils. And especially for the gas tankers which use for example the boiler gas, bunkering very low sulfur fuel oil may not be a good option at the start. You may think about bunkering gas oil or something else at the start, because it may remain on board for a few months. What our practical experience at the moment of these very low sulfur fuel oil, at least one of them, is that it has deteriorated over the time. Like we checked with the different time spans, its stability on its own, it's gone worse after 1 month. So it's not definitely the true replication of what the industry will provide, but that gives you the concerns that may arise from this. So ISO 8217 will do its best, and they are looking at the different parameters. I cannot go in more detail, but I think it will be, or if it is not currently, it will be soon in the balloting stage, and hopefully it will be published end of August, start of September. But one thing is clear, that ISO PS, publicly available specification, that is not expected to to give you another set of the fuel grades that is expected to address your concerns and let you and inform you that what can be done. For example, if you are talking about, you are concerned about stability or compatibility, it may guide you about what else you can do. For example, there are different test methods, let's say Porla or ROFA, whatever it is. It may be that you need to go to the supplier and say, look, I have one fuel which is Porla or ROFA, whatever its rating is, for example 3. Can you please check the same test and let me know that will give you the two things. One, stability is definitely there, but it also gives an indication of compatibility as well. But that cannot be done if you have only the transactional relation with the supplier, so that you need to, I think that you have more as your partner in your operations than only the, time is up and I hate to go above time. So these are some real issues which we have identified. Overheating and underheating, both an issue, and on one of the ships, for example, we identified what will happen to the excess steam. Do your condenser have the capacity to turn it back to the water? So things like, very small things like this, if you don't need steam in the tanks, what you will do with that. I think it's up, and thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, just let me know.
We have a coffee break now. We have about 10 minutes for that. It's just outside. Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, we'll move to the next speaker. Exxon is obviously a world leader in marine lubricant technology and fuels, and they are very prepared for 2020. We have already seen the headway they have made on the fuel side and obviously on the lubricant side. Philippos Athanasiadis is here, who is an engineering services manager. He will talk about scrape down analysis and if it's required beyond 2020. So we have a poll question now. And the poll question relates to the use of cylinder oil after 2020. So will ships using only compliant fuel need more than one type of cylinder oil? Yes, they will need different types of products in the ECA operations and outside the ECA operations. No, they will use the same product in ECA and outside ECA. They will need a different type of product for ship users, ultra low sulphur, that is around 0.03. So please vote, and Philippos will give you the actual answer when he's up. I think it's very clear, and I tend to agree with the result.
Good afternoon. I want to thank Bunkernet for their invitation in this bunker conference. Someone could say that definitely ExxonMobil is, let's say, a bunker supplier, but what a person from a Marine Lubricants division is doing in this conference, the short answer is that fuel and oil, as long as they enter inside the cylinder, they have a very common life. This is a short answer, but later on in this presentation we will try to cover this subject in more extent. So, scrape down oil analysis, why are we thinking about this? Because as you are preparing for a 2020 fuel developments, possibly there are questions like, okay, what if I do a correct deal, buying the correct fuel at the correct price, good quality, but still it's a live environment. So someone would say, what if something happens afterward, if my fuel is not so stable, if my tanks were finally not in an ideal condition? Is there a way somehow to handle all this and be able not to have, let's say, big problems later on? So this presentation will try to cover questions like this. Scrape down oil analysis. To summarize, ExxonMobil since 2002 has pioneered this way of monitoring via the used cylinder oil. And the question is to what extent it will be required beyond 2020 and how it can help us. Here we can see the well-known, I would say, regime related with the fuel offer developments. We had in the past a regime with a 3% sulphur fuel, and as we go and we approach 2020, we will end up at the well-known 0.5%. At the same time, ECA will stay at the levels that we currently operate. So we see at the same time that all this latest, let's say 6-7 years period, there were various developments related with engine designs and with an attempt to reduce the overall greenhouse gas emissions. You know there is a target that from 2008 roughly to 2050 to reduce something like about 50% the green gas emissions, and for these reasons there are some NOx targets and some CO2 targets. At the same time, the engine operators have modified their engines, and this means more demands, more monitoring, and more or less by the time we had the Tier 2 regime and the new, let's say, well-known corrosive engines, the basic engine makers started requiring and suggesting more strongly in their service letters that you do more close monitoring, more close follow-up of your cylinder condition. Cylinder condition means cylinder oil and fuel oil operation. More stress was put on the cylinder oil and more demand for monitoring. This is the regime as we know it right now and the options that someone is facing in relation with the 2020 choices. As we know so far, more or less about, let's say, maximum 6% of vessels are expected to follow the scrubber abutment technology, and the rest is expected to run, at least in the beginning, with some sort of 2020 compliant fuels. This is expected to have some implications. As you know, there are some concerns about the quality of these fuels, about the way that we should handle them. Here you see the overall well-known refining process. We still expect that with a new type of fuels, we will notice phenomena of catalytic fine contents in the fuel in significant quantities. We will still have the catalytic cracking process to be able, let's say, to break the hydrocarbons in smaller molecules. As you know, nothing can be done, at least ideally, in the beginning and for some time until we gain enough experience in this sector. Apart from this, you all know that what we foresee is that future fuels, irrelevant of the supplier, and I'm not talking also about ExxonMobil, I'm talking about the greater industry, might happen to have a blended type of fuel. Blended means a mixture of the well-known aromatics that we knew so far with paraffinics. This will make things more complicated. Aromatic fuels, aromatic type of crudes that were used so far were overall more stable and managed to keep the asphaltings of the fuel in an acceptable condition without them becoming like sludge and deposits. The paraffinic part of the new fuels, which is related more or less with the diesel oil style mixing, will help to reduce the sulfur content finally, but at the same time we will create some instability problems. So a good blender should try to match all this to come to the best possible result. Again, then as you see, there is a need for monitoring. I talked earlier about the catalytic fines. Here you can see two different cases, a cylinder liner case and a piston ring case, which face this. I think that unfortunately, more or less at some stage, all of you might have happened to face such a condition. This is like a grinding paste. If it goes in the liner area and in the piston rings area and is not, let's say, monitored well in advance, is not detected well in advance, then it can become very catastrophic. We have noticed cases where cylinder liners have, let's say, wear significantly in 1.5 day and things like this. Since this will still continue together in our life, together with the other phenomena that I mentioned earlier on, it is very important to be able to monitor in advance as much as possible. You possibly know the original engine manufacturer's guidance about the minimum level of cut fines that the purifier should, let's say, manage the fuel and bring before the fuel goes in use, let's say. This is the guidance, but this does not always happen in reality, because you know that you don't have also the luxury to have on board like a laboratory and be able to, let's say, analyze your fuel samples before they go in the engine. And at this phase, I will try to explain in more detail about the monitoring part. As I told you earlier on, cylinder oil and fuel oil coincide inside the engine. Scrape down cylinder oil analysis is more or less like the blood check that we do ourselves. When you monitor the condition of the oil, by itself, naturally, you monitor overall the condition of the cylinder. So this has to do with whatever is interacting inside there. What is interacting is the air, humidity, fuel, cylinder oil, and the engine design and the engine condition. So as a result, when we do this type of analysis, we do trend analysis and we see results of this type which can give us an early notice that something is going on. So the more data you have of this type, the more possible it is that you will identify any unpleasant phenomena related with your fuel condition or your tank condition and be able to handle them. For example, in this case, you see the blue dots, which are the latest results. You see various other results in the past. Quite often you see that there is enough TBN, which is the alkalinity covering the sulfur oxides of the fuel, but still you notice some elevated, let's say, ion levels. In the beginning, someone could say that there's no explanation about this, since there is enough oil, enough alkalinity. Why do we have such phenomena? because there is an additional interaction related with the fuel condition that was entered inside the engine. Someone can see a lot of graphs like this and see the importance of a quick monitoring of the oil condition, which practically means monitoring of the fuel quality inside your cylinder also. Just to give you an idea that everything at the end comes down to a cost issue and how important it is to monitor one cylinder, a series of cylinders, and overall the condition of your vessel, and avoid to have any downtime of your vessel. An independent club, the Swedish club, had made an overall study where they estimated that the average cost due to a lubrication failure can be up to this dollar level. So again, you have a good idea that this is not just an additional measure, just an additional practice for the chief engineer, but is one of the most important, particularly in relation with the 2020 developments. And here I will try to explain you a bit more how all this works and why we are giving so much attention to this. Ourselves also being pioneers in this type of monitoring since 2002. We have thousands of data anymore, which gave us the opportunity to go into much details and provide some statistics. So you see these statistics here, which talk by themselves. More or less, they cover lubricant consumption issues, they cover fuel and cut fines issues, and they overall provide useful info in the way like something better needs to be done from many operators, because conditions are not easy. And an additional fact related with this is the fact that both engine makers during the last, let's say, 5 to 6 years, when we also started having more problems with fuels and also more problems with new designs of engines, in their service letters they published strong guidance to follow this kind of monitoring. And at this time also, as we are approaching 2020, and again, we still expect the engine makers' guidance on how to operate in terms of fuel and cylinder oil combination with this new regime. We expect, from what we know, although they haven't taken a position yet because some tests are in progress, that again, unfortunately, they will not manage to be absolutely specific, black and white. They will give some guidance, but they will say, check in practice, follow a monitoring program in order to see in practice in your particular engine, not even in sister vessels, how it works, what is your fuel condition, what is your engine condition, and what you need to do. So, with this occasion, ExxonMobil, let's say, had seen that all this situation was coming up, and this year we decided finally, and we were able to advance our Mobile Silver condition service. You can see details about this service in our study in the expedition, in the exhibition, but more or less what we have managed to do is to have more or less a laboratory on board the vessel, which gives you the opportunity to analyze the most important stuff as often as you want, and be able to have a very user-friendly environment for chief engineers also, because, you know, we don't want to be in a position to ask you to do something which is time-consuming and the crew will not accept. We all know that crew nowadays are not easy to handle, they want less load. So we have made a new, very user-friendly, automated environment, which in about 10-15 minutes will provide you and your crew with a report covering the main aspects of the cylinder oil, used cylinder oil analysis, which practically means, in a way, a monitoring of the fuel burning inside your cylinder. And another very important feature, someone would say about their supply of fuel, how about also if I could have something to, let's say, verify my fuel sulfur content as soon as I take my bunkers. This new monitoring service does have also this ability to monitor, independent of the cylinder oil, this part of the engine operation. So more or less, I will not go into the cylinder oil part of the benefits of this monitoring, which is not so much the subject of this conference, but definitely there's a benefit in relation with your 2020 fuel handling concerns. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker will discuss the developments in LNG bunkering. But before I invite Mr. Polychroniou, I would just like to take the opportunity to congratulate Softcom Float Group for having the new generation LNG powered Aframax tanker Garagin Prospect shortlisted for the 2019 Ship of the Year by Marine Propulsion. We have several key people from SCF today in the audience. Successes like this are really a catalyst for developing new age fuels and creating the critical mass for us to move forward, so congratulations for that. Now for the LNG, we have a short poll again. The question is, what do you think is the biggest issue for the uptake of LNG? Lack of supply of infrastructure, cost of installing LNG fuel systems, and competency of ship crew and LNG suppliers. What do you think is the biggest barrier? It's like the Oscars. Okay. It's pretty evenly laid out between installing the technology and having the supply infrastructure. So it's very logical. Mr. Polychroniou. Mr. Polychroniou is the Poseidon II Project Manager, Executive Director of Strategy, Business Development, Administration and IT of the Public Gas Corporation of Greece, DEPA. Please, Mr. Polychroniou.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I will talk about, I understand that the majority of the audience today is interested about what will happen in next months or even in 2020, but I will talk about more about the future. And we think that LNG is at least one of the solutions for the future. Let's start by a short review of the regulatory regime. We all know, and we discussed the sulphur cap, which is the first target in 2020. This is something the marine industry has to comply with in the next months. We know that there is this global sulphur cap following the decision of the IMO, and the decision is final, and there is no regrets now after a long period of discussions. Now the question is regarding the means of compliance, and not the question whether to comply or not. There are, of course, stricter rules in some areas, in the so-called ECAs, as we know, and the ECAs for the time being are the ECAs in Europe, in Northern Europe, in North America, and in China. But we have to remember that we may have additional ECAs in the future, and the Mediterranean Sea may be one of them. But let's not forget that sulphur cap and sulphur restrictions is just one of the restrictions regarding the environment, and there are additional restrictions. There are already some restrictions regarding the nitrogen oxides in the ECAs, and there are also other restrictions, ballast water management regulation, energy efficiency, and as you can see in this graph, there are others which may come, and one of them which will for sure be in the future will be the restriction regarding greenhouse gases, and this is, of course, this is based on the IMO decision of 2018, if I remember well, but there are additional restrictions to come in this area, and we should not forget that we may have also additional restrictions regarding, for instance, particular matters inside ports or in coastal areas. So the main answer the ship owners have to give is not only what they will do in order to comply with 2020, but what they will do if they are long-term, if they have a long-term view, what to decide about the future, about the next years and the next decades, especially regarding new builds, new ships, which will come in operation in the coming years. And if you see the available solutions in taking into account all the parameters and not the sulphur cap only, then you will see that the LNG is the most efficient solution and the best solution, because it is not only a solution for the sulphur cap, but it gives also answers to the majority of the potential concerns regarding environment. We know that, for instance, it eliminates particular matters, so there is no issue about that. There are much lower emissions of nitrogen oxides, at least under certain conditions. And regarding the greenhouse gas, there is up to 25% reduction of emission, and this is also related to the conditions, to the engine and to the mode of operation. So, in comparison with other alternative eco-fuels, because of course there are other eco-friendly fuels in view, but in comparison with all of them, natural gas is the only fuel which can provide a solution right now, is efficient, and is also cost efficient. Can provide a cost for ship owners which is in the order of the cost which they may have with other oil fuels compatible with the sulfur cap restrictions. Let's see a little bit more regarding LNG. LNG in the last year is a market which has experienced a very significant growth, not only in volume terms, but also in importance. Just some numbers: global LNG trade increased sharply in 2018, following a strong performance also in 2017, rising to 28 million tons of LNG, and now it is more than 300 million tons of LNG. This was one of the three highest years of LNG commercial operation. The other two were 2010 and 2017. This very strong utilization of LNG is expected to continue also in 2019. The market is constantly, also this is something very important, why LNG is growing so substantially, is because LNG is the form of natural gas which can be considered as a commodity like fuel oil, like oil products. And we see that natural gas, the LNG market is constantly moving away from oil-linked contracts, and LNG becomes in reality a global commodity with pricing mechanisms more and more related to LNG supply and demand, and not as before related to oil. So we have to have in mind that LNG has its own market, and this market will be in the future in reality a different market than the oil market. You see here global LNG demand, and you can see that according to all projections, LNG demand will experience a very big growth also in the coming years, and according to all projections. Non-OECD Asia, especially China and India, are the drivers of this growth of LNG demand. And Europe, in reality, remains a residual market because a big amount of the gas consumed in Europe comes also under the form of piped gas and not as LNG. One other perspective is that LNG transportation will become a very important parameter in the evolution of the LNG market. And when I'm talking about transportation, it's not only marine transportation, but also road transportation. Heavy-duty vehicles are more and more using LNG in all Europe, and not only Europe, but in many countries. China, for instance, has a very long, very strong utilization of LNG in this field. What about supply? In in terms of supply of LNG has a much greater expansion in the last years than the LNG demand. We have substantial increase of, we had substantial increase in liquefaction capacity, which began in 2016 and continued through 2018, with significant additions in Russia and Australia. And further liquefaction capacity has been sanctioned for development, the majority of which is under construction in the United States. Approximately 60% of the current liquefaction build-out is expected to be completed by the end of 2020. That means that we have, in reality, an oversupply currently, and this creates conditions for the LNG to be very economic, at least in the next 2-3 years. And this is very obvious in this graph. You see that until at least 2025, there are the just announced and decided additions in LNG liquefaction capacity cover the demand, and you see that only after 2025 the expected demand will need additional final investment decisions of projects in order to be covered. But let's take in mind that you see there that there is a lack of around 300 million tons until 2040, but just the projects which are already in place are at least 2 or 3 times higher than this demand. So it is sure that supply will for sure cover demand for all this period, and that means that LNG will be offered at very good prices in relation to other energy projects. Let's come now to the to our sector, to the marine sector, and just to see that this is the evolution of the shipping of the ships which are expected to use LNG. We see that currently this is an answer for the future, and having in mind in front of us the target of 2020, it is obvious and it is normal that the ship owners decide take decisions based on the available solutions for fuel oil, scrubbers or low sulfur fuel oil in view of the 2020, and LNG in reality is a solution for the new builds, and this is the expectation also of DNV. DNV projects, and we see also that based on the decisions which are taken now for new builds, the majority of new builds are going to use LNG. This is a very interesting issue. So if we see what is the expectation for LNG market share in the bunker as bunker fuel, what is certain is that LNG demand for bunkering, based on all the assessments, will be higher than will be substantial. A crucial parameter of this growth is the availability of the necessary infrastructure, as we have seen in the poll. Also, the availability of funding for the necessary decisions, because we have to bear in mind that LNG ships have an additional cost in relation to traditional ships. And of course, what is very important is how ship owners will cover this difference, and the answer to this question is a very essential one. Based on Shell projection, in line with the central IHS scenario, by 2035 we expect that LNG will cover around 35 to 40 million tons of global consumption. And if we go further, in 2050, this is the projection of DNVGL. And you see that according to DNVGL forecast, by 2050, around 40% of shipping energy will be supplied by carbon neutral fuels, slightly surpassing the liquid fossil fuels such as MGO and HFO, which together will supply 1/3 of the energy demand. And LNG will account for around 1/4 of the energy use, while electricity will have a very slight percentage, around 5%. But we have to remember that this blue part of the graph, which is the part of fuels, carbon neutral fuels, in this part there is also a substantial part of LNG carbon free, which may be provided as bio-LNG or decarbonized LNG. So LNG is a solution in many ways in reality. And what about infrastructure? Infrastructure in all major ports is developed. It is 9 of 10 largest ports will have LNG bunkering facilities by 2020 or just after 2020. And it is there are a lot of plans for such an infrastructure and for LNG bunkering infrastructure, as we will see also in our area. What is important is, okay, let's say we will have LNG, very important question, but at what cost? At which cost? And if we consider the MGO price as the long-term alternative of LNG, we can see that in reality the LNG commodity price has an important margin in relation to MGO, which can in reality support not only the cost of the LNG infrastructure, but also the cost of ship owners to build ships using LNG. That means that LNG can be offered at prices with a difference, with a margin in relation to MGO, which can allow ship owners to recover then their necessary investments. And also, what is important to say is that the LNG can also be offered in commercial terms, which are related to fuels which are used currently by ship owners, like MGO. So pricing of natural gas can be provided in relation to MGO in order to offer the ship owners a direct relation with the currently using fuels. last part is developments in the East Med. Of course, we know that we have seen that LNG is something which is developed more or less everywhere in Europe. What are we doing in East Med to support this perspective? We have, first of all, a project, Poseidon Med 2. I'm project manager of this. We started in 2015, and this project will last until next year in 2020. This was a preparation project for 3 countries, Greece mainly, but also Cyprus and Italy, in order to allow the 3 countries to prepare themselves in view of this perspective. It was concerning mainly the infrastructure part, the facilities in the terminal of Revithousa, the facilities in the major ports involved, 4 ports in Greece, Piraeus, Iraklio, Igoumenitsa and Patra, the port of Limassol in Cyprus and the port of Venice in Italy. Also, there were included designs regarding vessels using LNG. So this was a preparation, and now we are. Last year we had to take a decision about the next step. We took this decision. DEPA, our company, is the main gas supplier in Greece. We have decided to be a pioneer in this field, and together with very good partners, we have submitted a proposal which was accepted by INEA, by European Union, for the next step, the implementation of the infrastructure regarding LNG in the East Med, and this is the project Blue Hub. This is a project which, as I mentioned, has been accepted. It's a project of 65 million euro. It concerns 2 countries, Greece and Cyprus. We have a funding of 30% from European Union, and what we will do in this project, and this is the most important message I want to give you, is that in 3 years from now, it is expected, based on this project, to have 2 vessels, one in Greece and one in Cyprus, 2 LNG bunkering vessels to cover the needs in Greece and Cyprus. In Greece, the ship will be based in the port of Piraeus, in Cyprus in the port of Limassol. Also, there is a part of the project which is concerning the port of Iraklion in Crete, which also is covered in view of the LNG bunkering perspective. It will be provided with LNG, and there are also additional facilities, LCNG stations in Iraklion in Crete and in Limassol in Cyprus, in order to be able to provide LNG bunkering in Iraklion, and also for additional conventional customers, not only in Greece but also in Cyprus. So, in 3 years from now, we will be able to provide also LNG for ship owners in East Mediterranean, and this is the very important message. So, concluding, LNG is a long-term solution. This is a solution which can comply not only with current but also with future restrictions, environmental restrictions. This is a tested solution. It is a cost-efficient solution, and it will be in our area in 3 years from now. Thank you very much.
Again, ship owners are forced to take painful decisions to comply with tough regulations. So we thought that we really need to have a ship owner here to discuss their point of view. We have invited my very good friend Stavros Meidanis, who is the DPA safety manager for capital ship management in Greece. And he will give the owner's perspective. Before we do that, let's have our very last poll. And this is to do with the obstacles for scrubber installations. The three obstacles: installation cost, concerns about the actual availability of the high sulfur fuel oil, and regulatory uncertainty about open loop systems. Okay. It's always about the money. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Stan.
So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank you, Bunkernet, for the invitation and the opportunity that we have to present the concerns that we have from the ship owner's perspective. This morning, starting this session, we heard a lot about the regulations that we have in front of us, market analysis, and everything. So I'm going to, most of the topics are already covered, but I would like to give a little bit different approach, and I would like to focus on the concerns that a shipping, an operator, a manager, ship manager, has to deal and has to cope with the new challenge that we have in front of us with regards to 2020. So, very briefly, we know Annex 6, we discussed this morning extensively, specifies that we have to move from 3.5% to a maximum 0.5, starting on the 1st of January 2020. We know that, but on a worldwide basis, and this is very, very important, in comparing what we had up to now regarding ECAs, ECA areas, etc., etc. We're almost 6 months, 7 months away from 2020, 1st of January 2020, and we're still discussing. We're not sure about the regulation, we're not sure about the implementation, we're not sure what we have to do, how on board the vessel, actually, now I'm talking about, actually we have the vessel, what will be the decision? Yes, but the regulation has been known since October 2016. I'm very glad that finally, maybe it's the first time that it was not only the Greeks, that it was running last minute. I would say that is all the whole shipping industry right now. I'm very happy at least once. Okay, compliance options. Three mainly commonly accepted compliance options, namely, as we heard this morning, of course, switching from high fuel oil to distillates. Okay, we just heard about the LNG as a marine fuel, a very good analysis, and of course installing exhaust gas emission cleaners, and mostly we're talking about scrubbers. First option, distillator based on the low sulfur fuel is expected to be the most acceptable option. We heard a lot of analysis this morning, taking into consideration the technical aspect of, but also the cost. The future cost and availability is unknown. We can have some speculations, but actually the availability and the cost is unknown. And of course we have the concerns, and we heard a lot of things today about the committing characteristics if we blend the fuels and the impact of the engines, on the engines. LNG as a marine fuel still need significant investment in infrastructure. I think this is something that came up also from the previous speaker and presentation, that although, however, a lot of steps have been going through. As stated, I fully agree with that, it's primarily suited for new buildings, because if we have to retrofit to its existing vessels, it's, I would say, is a painful option due to cost and the difficulties that we have to deal with during this process of retrofitting. LNG installation also requires substantial capital investment and is not the first line option for a ship owner or operator up to now. But as we heard just in the previous presentation, we have 30 years up to 2050, a plan explaining how the LNG as a marine fuel is going to expand it. Finally, scrubbers could be an option as well, that affords the owners, operators the opportunity to continue to burn lower cost high fuel oil. Of course, there are scrubbers are costly capital expenditure, but based on an effective, based on a cost-effective analysis, a wide spread between the price of high fuel and the MGO means the cost of installing scrubbers can be recouped in just a few years. So we have a acceptable for the ship owner return on investment. I would like to, although we already touched upon this topic, I would like to express the safety concerns that we may have, and now I'm talking about of the ship owner, ship management perspective, purely running vessels on a daily basis. So safety concerns with regards to fuel switch have been raised. It is unknown how the machinery could react to operating with much lower viscosity fuels as an MGO. Maybe we expected fractures and gaps in pipes in the pipelines, the pipe system, but also leakages which pose a threat of breakdown, blackout, or even fire. Without saying anything now, I would like to recall your memory, go back a couple of years, 3 years back, when we started changeover. I don't want to expand further, but a lot of issues reported regarding blackouts and breakdowns due to this process. So, okay, we coped with those problems, but that will happen a couple of years back. It is expected, most probably, to have similar problems. On the other hand, even the IMO identified the potential danger areas, such as fuel pump puncture, auxiliary boilers, pump seals, circulation pumps, fuel oil filters. We are not sure how our existing equipment on board the vessel is going to react. And of course, regarding the blended fuel concerns, there's not only the quality, because it was not possible to have the fuel test before, but also the compatibility, and we heard a lot of things regarding compatibility issues that all of us were trying to address. And at the end of the day, and now I'm addressing 100% to the ship operators, the management of change process is something that we have to take into consideration and to pay attention, because it's a huge project when we have to change, retrofit, reinstall such kind of equipment, and we have to take into consideration a lot of parameters. I will come very, very soon to that one. Finally, in summary, regarding with regards to those three options. For scrubbers, okay, we need to plan. Scrubbing may be the lowest cost route for compliance, but again, a number of concerns regarding the technology confidence that we have. It's a brand new technology. Ship owners' funds obtaining the return on investments, as we discussed earlier, and certainly on future environmental regulation. Also, the open time scrubbers may prove beneficial for larger ships. Yes, that's true, technically speaking. I'm stopping here to remind that we have the last 3 months local China, Singapore, that they say that open loop scrubbers are not allowed to the ports. That would be another problem. Now there are some discussions to explain it, to find a solution. Less beneficial for smaller ships equipped with hybrid or closed loop scrubbers. Majority of the ships will use low sulfur fuel oil, having in mind that they are going to face some problems. And ship management need to be prepared for more bunkering space to have on board dedicated tanks, etc., as we said. Now, with regards to LNG as a fuel and blended fuels, yes, this is the 2050 new IMO strategy for curbing CO2 emissions by 50%. So the LNG would be an option. Blending low sulfur will be available at major bunkering ports, with shortages sometimes, taking into consideration due to stability and compatibility issues. Price-wise, we heard an extensive and very good analysis this morning. The differential will be about 100 USD, maybe the numbers are somewhere around. Low sulfur fuel, more expensive, of course, than the high sulfur, but price differential over time may go down around to 100 USD. And of course, we expected the price of low sulfur fuel oil may be raised a little before 2020. In simple words, and just to have a graph, we can see the evolution in the bunker price differentials to deviate, what is expected at least to deviate after 2020. I'm going to see the MGO 0.5 after 2020 has a more linear approach. So, concluding, all of us, our industry, our shipping industry is highly regulated, and there's a lot of regulations in front of us. We're discussing about the decarbonization of our shipping industry. We all agree, but we have to be sure how we're going to do that in a proper way, in an effective and efficient way, have in our hands effective solutions. We have to cope as a shipping industry with challenges, but also concerns. I just presenting a couple of them. And I will also add that at this point that we have the concerns and the challenges in front of us with regards to 2020, how the local authorities, port state controls, were going to react. We heard about 1st of March, okay, but it's up to them to decide. You know very, very well, commercially, what happens and what does that mean for ship management to have troubles and observation and detentions or whatever it is with regards to as a result of the post-state control inspection. And, of course, another big concern is the human element. I think we mentioned earlier today that the human element is very, very important. We are talking here this morning about regulations, analysis, market analysis, future developments, and when we come on board the vessel, we have our people, and we expect for them to run the vessels and the engines and we give instructions and for modification and everything, and we are discussing about blended fuels or new fuels or fantastic type of fuels or whatever it is, but we have to train them because they are doing the whole job there, and they have to be well trained, well aware, in order to be able to make their job effectively on board the vessel. And finally, with all this approach, we need to send the message to society that shipping industry cares about the environment and everything. Thank you very much for your attention.
Now we'll invite Nigel Draffin to sit down on a panel discussion together with all the speakers. It will give everybody here an opportunity to ask the questions that the specific questions that they want to ask. Nigel knows everything. He's a consultant, an author, and a lecturer. He's been at sea for many, many years, and he does this all the time. So, you know, he gets perception from all around the world. So if somebody can wrap it up, it's Nigel. So I invite all the speakers to come up, please, and please get ready with your questions. If you can't do the question through the app, we also have microphones, so we can do it the old-fashioned way. It's not a problem. I think we have your mic. We have radio mics. Yeah, we do.
Yeah. Oh, we're going to put right. That's fine. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, or good afternoon, I think it is in some parts of the world. Whilst the speakers are provided with microphones, this is your part of the show. I'm looking for you to give us questions. There will be a roving mic, so if you want to ask a question, you stick your hand up and you'll be given a microphone so that you can speak. I am just here to see fair play, effectively the referee. The only problem is nobody's told me what the rules are yet. So I think we're just about ready to go. Okay, thank you. I think we are ready to go. You have now a selection of specialists in front of you. You've listened. You have listened to what they had to say about what we have to look forward to. Has anybody got a burning question that they would like to put to a particular member of the panel or to the panel in general?
there's the first question, it's behind you, so you can't see it.
Exactly.
So the first question was where the marble sample will be drawn from the barge, the tanks, or the ship's manifold.
Right, I think there is one person on this panel who's eminently suited to answering that question. I refer to my director, Uni.
Well, you say director, but as a board member, you're also the director. The question is slightly misunderstood. There is only one sample which is known as the marble sample, and that's the delivered marble sample. And this comes at the time of delivery to ship. There are guidelines for taking it, and the IMO guideline states that it should be a continuous drip sample taken at the vessel's inlet manifold. However, we know in practice, because this is just a guideline, and as such it's not a regulation, it's not a mandatory requirement. The sample is a mandatory requirement, but exactly how it's drawn is not a mandatory requirement. So the preference is to follow the guidelines, but it can also be taken during delivery at the barge, outlet manifold, or anywhere along the hose, but it needs to be a continuous drip sample so that it's representative of what's delivered to the ship. There are other types of samples which have been brought into play now, and that's the in-use sample drawn from the ship. It's also used to verify marble compliance, but it's not a marble sample. And the other type of sample which the IMO will develop guidelines for is samples, onboard samples taken from fuel tanks on the ship, i.e. somewhere where you have fuel intended for use. And that's also for marble compliance, but it's not a marble sample as such, it's the onboard sample.
Any other panelists want to add to that?
Yeah.
Okay, Naeem.
Just adding to what Uni said, the thing is actually industry is too concerned about where to take the sample, and I think that our focus should be how to take the sample, and focus should be the sample should be representative. Yes, if that is done, in my experience as well, and also in the fact that if it is taken either side of the hose, it doesn't really make any difference at all. Even if you consider the whole of the fuel delivery pipe is full of water or full of anything crap, it doesn't make any difference at all. So I think that the focus should be in discussion with the supplier. Focus should be one sample, and it should be taken during the delivery and as per the the instructions laid out by the IMO or bunker drip sample, and that's it. I think that will hopefully curb this question in future.
I'm really pleased to see that another marine engineer on this panel agrees completely with me. It doesn't matter which end of the hose it is.
And I also totally support that principle. It's the sample is taken properly and that it's witnessed. That's the key. But when I say the preference is to follow the IMO guidelines, that is the preference expressed by large swathes of the shipping industry, at least the shipping organizations at the IMO.
Us engineers were in the minority.
So there are another. These questions are for Eleni, but of course anybody can answer them. So how accurate can be the price predictions right now? Do we have enough data? Can we trust any prediction?
I think that you'll notice that I didn't actually give you a price of 0.5% fuel in my presentation. And that's kind of the general kind of view of the market. Why would you want to put a value on 0.5% fuel when there's so many different factors that still haven't been addressed in the market and so many things that are changing? I think as much as everyone wants to know the price of 0.5% fuel yesterday, in reality, the market should be focusing on other factors like testing the fuels, making sure they're available and stuff. And yes, okay, we will have a forward curve in a couple of months, which will give us a better indication of where the market is actually trading the product and where they see the value of 0.5%. But to give an actual prediction of 0.5% fuel today, and as you all know, there's so many kind of political and economic instability issues that arise in the market, it's too difficult to give you a flat answer. And there are estimates out there, but I don't feel confident enough to share them.
Anybody else got comments on the problem of predicting the price?
Yes, I think that even when we will be able to have this fuel really in the market being delivered, it will take some time to have the real pricing, because we might even have quality issues in short term, which might influence, offer and demand case. So it will take time.
Okay, shall we move on to the next question?
Next question.
Yeah.
Which part of the world is better prepared for the post-2020 era?
It depends who you speak to. If you speak to a refiner, refiners are prepared. For example, Exxon seem to be very prepared. Asia seems to be the most confident region. They've got the 0.5% eco zone already. It's being tried and tested today at 1 year ahead. And additionally, the areas that have the eco zones, the 0.1% eco zones, people are used to complying with lower sulphur fuels. It's just for a more prolonged period of time and on the high seas. So on paper, the Mediterranean, for example, an area that isn't used to complying with a 0.1% regulation, that's an exciting area to focus on, because there is this new element that's going to be added to the picture. But Asia, well prepared. Europe, well prepared. Latin America, different question. Anyone else want to add?
Well, the only comment I would make is that if you look at how we control compliance, you correctly pointed out that people who are within ECAs have experience, not only the ship operators, but also the port authorities, port state control officers, have experience in managing this policing. However, once we move away from North America or Northern Europe, we enter areas where you may have signatory states with competent port state control, but who have virtually no experience in day-to-day policing of onboard sulphur levels. And that, I think, is an area which is going to be difficult, at least during 2020.
The next question, perhaps I should answer this one. So it's please clarify the comment that Malta, you don't have to pay port dues. Is this only applicable to bunker supplies? What was said was basically when you do a bunker on a call in Malta, because in Malta it's an OPL delivery. The answer to that is that you pay an anchorage fee and then a small fee for the length overall of the vessel, and the agency fee. That's what it was referring to. You don't need to pay a large amount of money to be able to bunker in Malta. That's what the reference was about. The next question is there any feedback from the banks for 2020? Are they open to increased credit lines for owners? This is an excellent question.
I think Stavros should start on that one.
I'm just one of the best, not all the best. Unfortunately. I would say, I'm not sure, I don't want to give a straight answer with regards to banks, but I would say regarding charters, I would change a little bit. Yes, based on the trade and on the segment I'm talking about, wet or dry, and of course, if we're talking about containers, it's another story. Yes, the answer is that charterers, I'm not talking about banks at that time, first of all, charterers are willing to share or to pay a part of the cost in order to cope and answer to new 2020 requirements, first of all. This is one thing, because in the equation, at least for me, the banks open to increase the credit lines in view of the 2020. It's general, I don't know, I'm not sure. But
Stavro, I think it's referring more to if the banks are willing to support the bunker market on the 2020, of the coming of the 2020. So if there's going to be enough credit in the market to be able for the ship owners to comfortably continue running their fleets while buying more expensive bunkers. I think this is the...
okay, what can I say? I see a turn of the banks to finance, to open finance to different types of ships with more clean energy, first of all, and also not only, as we discussed earlier, with a propulsion energy as a fuel, the gas propulsion, but also to carry more clean LNGs, LPGs. This is something that I can see. I have some data in my mind in front of me. Let's say that the banks open the credit.
If I can make a comment, I think the question is more timely put to suppliers and traders, which are the ones that provide the credit lines to the shipping companies. And among them there is some nervousness, and they're not all sure whether the banks are going to be willing to increase their credit facilities. And so this credit available in the market could become a bit pushed, because banks are looking at the whole thing thinking, that's an interesting business model. You have a high-risk business with very low margins, and now you want more credit. Are they going to do that? Something's got to give. Something has to change in the attitude to, the margins have to improve something.
I think traditionally traders played the role of a financing organization for bunkers. We've been doing that for many, many years. I think it's going to get a lot more difficult as we move to 2020. The reason being that there are a handful of very trustworthy bunker traders out there that can sustain the kind of credit lines that are required to run modern fleets. And I think it will be a challenge both on the bank side and actual equity that owners can put into trading houses to be able to sustain the 2020 increase in price.
Yeah, I think the only person here on the panel who we would look to as a large physical supplier and say, well, are you having trouble with credit? It's not really worth asking Philippos, because his company is bigger than the banks.
I know. That's why they pay too much attention to reputation. We first have safety and quality, so stock is very high, and then everything else.
The next question is technical, so maybe Naim would...
Yeah, I think this is definitely for Naim. Naim, can you see that? What level of cat fines do you expect to see in the 0.5% sulphur blends in 2020?
Simply, I don't know, but this is the fact. Actually, it depends. There are two type of things. Out of about 3 million barrels per day, approximately half may be produced through refining practices. Yes, and that's where the high risk area is, which actually blends the mix. The rest will be blended by currently the news is that it will be blended by mixing the gas oil and HFO. Yes. So what we have seen in the data so far is that irrespective of what you actually order, the fuel will be compliant to ISO 8217. But as I said that it may not be compliant to 2010. It will be compliant to 2005. So we see more percentage of the bunkers having the cat fines in the region of 50 to 80. Before it was more 10 to 30 or 40.
Can you explain why the new fuels will be adjudged on 2005 rather than on 2017?
No, not
which is the current standard.
Yeah. No, not the judged actually, because what data says that we have more percentage of fuels where very low sulfur fuel oils with sulfur content of 0.5. They have increased number of cat fines, but within the range of 2005 version. Yes.
So up to 80.
Up to 80. So it will be, and up to 80 means that it will be compliant on 2005. Maybe if you ask for 2010, they may blend it down and put the price up, but I think that will be more costly there maybe.
You want to make a comment?
Yes. I just want to say, I don't want to present it like there's no way to act beforehand, but apart from cat fines, we all experienced the recent Houston story with the Houston fuel. We studied this extensively, CIMAC studied this extensively. They didn't come out with a conclusion that there was a clear violation. more or less they speculated. They didn't come out with a conclusion on what was 100% wrong there. So the point is that there might be problems, so it's good also, as I said, to have some monitoring tools to be able to detect problems as soon as they appear.
The next question has to do with LNG. So what is the calorific difference between LNG and 3.5% RMG 380? If you have an Aframax, for example, how much LNG would you have to bunker compared to RMG 380 of the same voyage?
Right. Do you want to tackle that? Or I can tackle it?
I can say more about LNG. LNG is, has a calorific value of around 10,000 kilocalories per cubic meter of natural gas. Natural gas is 600 around cubic meter of LNG, 600 cubic meter of natural gas. So it's mathematics. I don't know exactly the answer. But
This is something that I get asked a lot and have written about quite a bit. In practice, especially for the larger size vessels, and I would take an Aframax as a larger size vessel, you will need at least 1.5 times the space for fuel storage inside the ship when compared against normal liquid fuels like 380. It does depend on the technology you use to store the LNG, and as you go for bigger ships, so once you get up to Cape-size bulkers, VLCCs, very large container ships, we're more likely to see what are called membrane tanks, type B tanks in IMO speak, type A and type B tanks. And there the percentage starts to drop a bit. We go down to maybe about 130%, because we can mould the tank more effectively into the space of the ship. So yes, you're going to, if you want the same steaming range, you are going to have to lose a bit of volume, either out of your machinery space or out of your cargo space. I mean, there's no question about that. However, in terms of deadweight, you need fewer tons of LNG to get the same amount of energy into the engine. So you lose out on volume, but you win on deadweight. So ships that are deadweight constrained, then yeah, that sort of helps you along a little bit, if that makes sense. It's just how much LNG would you have to bunker? Well, effectively, if it's by volume, you're going to have to take getting on for 1.5 times as much. If it's by mass, it's going to be less. The big problem is, if you're talking about big ships, you shouldn't be buying it either by volume or by mass. You should be buying it by energy, because that's the only sensible way to make the comparison between using heavy fuel oil, using marine gas oil, or using methane.
Absolutely. Next one. Okay. Mention was made for LNG bunkering Limassol. From where is this supply foreseen?
That's definitely you.
yeah, for Limassol, the supply mainly is expected from the FSIU, which will be in place in Cyprus. But of course, for a transition period, any supply from any other place can be foreseen. In any case, it is expected that the LNG bunkering facilities, not only in Cyprus but also in Greece, will be in place after the operation of the facilities, of the small-scale LNG facilities in Greece and Cyprus. There are already preparation, there is already preparation in Greece. In 2020 there will be truck loading facility station of Revitusa, which will provide the possibility of truck loading supply for bunkering in the late 2020, and in 2022 there will be a supply of LNG for small ships also from Revitusa. In Cyprus it is, as I mentioned, related to the project of FSIU, which is expected to be in place in the next couple of years.
So the FSIU is going to be here to supply gas to the island, and that would be also used as a source for the LNG product.
I mean, that is an interesting comparison, because there are a number of places around the world where we see either small-scale LNG import or an FSRU, which is put initially to supply gas to local thermal power plant, but because you end up with liquid stored close to the coast, it means it's much easier to start up LNG bunkering. And we're seeing examples, and the most obvious one is Gibraltar. But there's work going on in the Caribbean and the Canaries as well.
This is also the case in Greece. Of course, we mentioned that in Cyprus it will be the case, because in any case for Cyprus, the FSIU, the first commercial target of the FSIU in Cyprus is for power generation. And it can also be the case in Greece for the islands, because there are large islands in Greece in which there are needs for power generation, and also any installation can be also used for power.
So we have time for one more question. I think the second one is quite interesting, and I would also like to know the answer to this. How will vessels prepare to manage proper disposal of scrubber waste? And I think we should add to that if there are enough facilities to accept this kind of sulfur sludge that is going to come out of these scrubbers.
We have a ship management operator on the panel. Can you?
Yeah.
Would you like to run out to the doors for us?
No. First of all, we have to, as we mentioned earlier, scrubbers. We're talking about a new technology. We're talking about uncharted waters here. Only a few vessels have already compared with the global fleet I'm talking about, and it's, I would say, is also the first question is related. I can say a couple of things. The choice of the majority of the ship owner right now is the open loop scrubbers up to now. This is the data shown. We're not sure yet of only a few places in Asia mentioned, and some in Nordic part of Europe. Otherwise, we cannot say that we have all the facilities in place, and this is the problem. Trying to say a couple of things from the first questions. If the global fleet is ready for the 2020, my personal opinion, and for the feedback discussing with other ship operators worldwide, is that no. The answer is no. We are not ready. We didn't take proactive steps because that was the proper time in order to cope and to respond to 2020 challenges for the us. Actually, again, we were quite late. And this is, I don't know, this is my feedback, my personal opinion, but not only have the feedback for other colleagues worldwide.
Could I put a supplementary on that to Uni? what has been discussed with regard to the responsibilities of the ports in terms of receiving scrubber waste?
It's quite interesting actually that ports do have, or IMO member states do have a responsibility to provide waste reception facilities at ports. This is a responsibility that the member states have not been following through on at all, and it actually comes up in IMO discussions again and again and again that there just isn't enough waste reception facilities around the world for a variety of waste generated on ships that needs to be landed at regular intervals, because there comes to the time when you run out of storage space on the ship. So yeah, it is an issue. You know, some of the proactive areas have gone out. Singapore, when they announced that they would ban open discharges in their waters, also said that, on the other hand, they are going to provide waste reception facilities for waste. So you know, they gave with one, they took away with one hand, and they gave with the other. But I think there's far too few ports that have gone out and said something, so that that information isn't readily available today, and it's quite difficult to find. And really, this is not just related to waste from scrubber systems. It's all kinds of waste. Yeah.
It's a very, very good business opportunity for small suppliers. If you are a small supplier in a port who has the capability to supply 3.5% sulphur fuel, and you think you're going to have customers with it, those customers are going to want to get rid of scrubber sludge.
Absolutely.
So, make a few dollars.
Actually, a few more questions just came up. So, how will compliance be tested through the BDN or tested as the fuel enters the engine? It's the one on the bottom there.
I can't quite see that.
So, how compliance
Through the BDN.
If I can pipe up on that.
Yes, do.
You can't test compliance with the BDN. However, okay. You can't test for compliance with the BDN because the BDN just states the sulphur content as per the information provided by the supplier. However, the BDN is extremely important because it's the first piece of documentation that Port State Control will look at when they're looking at this. And the consensus in general is that Port State Control will not go beyond the BDN unless they have reason to suspect that there is a non-compliance. So the BDN might in many cases be the piece of documentation which is looked at first. But if you have a BDN that says that you're taking on high sulfur fuel oil and you don't have an IBP certificate supplement that shows you have an operating scrubber, then you're in trouble.
Suppose there's one regarding the
cylinder oils. Yeah, when should cylinder oils for 2020 be lifted?
Yeah, I would say roughly that after October 19 is a good period to start lifting this. Depending also on how you are going to use it. I mean, if you are dealing with a company which has, let's say, one cylinder oil for all 2020 fuels, then you can start lifting this for use in ECA area. Otherwise, if it's separate, yeah, you can handle accordingly. But overall, I would say that you should handle your ROBs, ECA ROBs of fuel, of cylinder oil, and ROBs of cylinder oil of outside ECA as of now, so that by end of October, they are going quite low, so you can start progressively to lift the new cylinder oils. I don't know, some companies, as I have here, might try, let's say, to trial or experience the new fuels also by that time, before January, and not wait for that time. So you should combine in this last quarter of 19, but try to minimize your ROBs progressively until that time, I would say.
There's a scary one underneath that. Well, how will all port state control inspectors globally treat sulphur content inspections at the same level? In other words, will all PSCs do their business in the same way to a level playing field? And provided nobody quotes me, I will say no.
We expect port state control inspectors, I'm talking about in the US Coast Guard, Paris MOU areas, to have Asia, some countries in Asia, for sure AMSA, to have a common approach. I'm sure that we're going to see during the second semester, the second half of 2019, so sort of guidelines with regards to this kind of issue, how it's going to proceed. But this is not all. It's not common. I fully agree with Angela.
If I may come in on that as well. I mean, there are MOUs which will try to ensure that the port state controls within the MOU are doing something similar. But it's not going to be exactly the same, because it's not even exactly the same today.
Anyway.
For example, in the European Union, there is a requirement to inspect a minimum number of ships, first on the documentation, and secondly to take samples from a minimum amount of those. In the US, taking samples from ships is almost unheard of. It doesn't happen. It's mostly just document inspection. And it becomes a matter of resources, because port state control people have a huge checklist to deal with when they go on board a ship. And so the extent to which port state control is going to have the capacity to go into detailed inspections, that's going to vary as well. And if you go towards testing fuel, then they have to pay for fuel testing as well. So no, I don't think it will be the same. And it will vary. Some countries will be more keen than others, and it depends on resources as well.
And just thought something that, based on what Moody just said, we may see, I'm not sure, as each year we have a CIC, concentrated inspection campaign, always in the second half of each year. Maybe it would be an extraordinary, let's say, concentrated inspection campaign based on that, having the 10 key questions or 10, 20 key questions in order to avoid to be a specialized inspection based on that one in order to see the implementation. Could be, I'm not saying, maybe it could be a good for the industry as well, from my point of view. But again, it depends on the MOU and the level of inspectors and the knowledge and everything. That's another story.
Exactly, and just with regard to that concentrated inspection campaign, it's happening now. And it's awareness building. And that awareness building with port state control officers will mean that they have a better idea what to do. So it's part of the training, if you like. So this is positive.
Yeah.
But again, it does come down to individual states, how keen they are on doing this, and resources.
Okay, so thank you very much. You have
There was one that I thought you might like to comment on as a closing question. And that was, how will the industry look when we meet for the 8th Bunkernet Conference?
Yes, it will be in 2021. I think that generally the industry is going to change a lot. I think a lot of the players, both as suppliers and ship owners, the map is going to change very much. I think a lot of people will exit the industry, and I think there's going to be a lot of consolidation within the industry. I also think that there's going to be a lot of demand for credit, and I think credit is going to be one of the major factors going after 2020. I think it's going to be an issue where a lot of ships are going to be in ports, and because they don't have credit lines or they cannot prepay the fuel, they're going to be stuck. I think we're going to see cases like that. Because we do see quite a big difference in the prices of fuel, and I think that it's going to be survival of the fittest for the first couple of years at least, and then things are going to be a lot more clear after that. But it's a game changer. Make no mistake about this. This is the most important thing since we've moved from coal to oil. This is the next big step. That's our opinion.
Anybody else on the panel want to comment on that? No, we're just making sure we've still got jobs. I think that's it.
Great. Okay. So thank you all very much for coming. Thank you very much. We're going to have lunch now outside. Just to remind you, at 4 o'clock the exhibition opens inside. If you can stay, it will be great. The minister will be here to open the exhibition. So we hope to have you at the exhibition as well. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.